What if Rhaegar Targaryen raised his son? Not the version the songs would tell the Shining Prince restored, the perfect father, the reunited dynasty producing a golden heir who fulfilled every prophecy and saved the world. Not that version. That version is a lie, and this story has enough lies in it already. The real version, Rhaegar Targaryen, survived the Battle of the Trident. Robert Baratheon did not. The rebellion collapsed. The way rebellions collapse when the figurehead dies not cleanly, not all at once, but in the specific grinding surrender of men who had been fighting for a person, and who discovered, with the person gone, that the cause wasn't enough to keep them in the field. Rhaegar came home. He deposed his father, the Mad King, the man whose madness had started the war by burning Rickard Stark alive in the throne room, the man whose continued existence on the Iron Throne was the one thing that every faction in the realm agreed could not be tolerated. Rhaegar deposed him with the quiet efficiency of a man removing a gangrenous limb. Necessary, surgical, not something you celebrated afterward. He became king. He went to the Tower of Joy. He found Lyanna dying. The birth, the blood, the fever, the specific medical catastrophe that turned a healthy woman into a memory in the span of hours. She was holding the baby when he arrived. She was not holding the baby when she left. Because she left. Because she died. Because the one thing that all of Rhaegar's prophecy and planning and carefully constructed destiny had not accounted for was that the woman he loved would die producing the child he believed would save the world. The baby lived. Rhaegar picked him up. And that was where it started, the thing that would consume them both. Not immediately. Not dramatically. In the slow, invisible way that obsession consumed the people who carried it, from the inside, starting at the center. Working outward, until the person holding the obsession couldn't distinguish between the obsession and themselves. Rhaegar loved his son. Rhaegar also believed his son was a prophecy made flesh, the prince who was promised, the song of ice and fire incarnate, the answer to a question that had been asked in scrolls and stars and smoke for 1,000 years. The love and the belief were not the same thing. They should have been incompatible. In a better man, a man less brilliant, less certain, less Targaryen, they would have been. But Rhaegar was Rhaegar. Rhaegar held contradictions the way other men held swords, with both hands, with full commitment, without acknowledging that the holding was tearing him apart. This is the story of a father who loved his son. It is also the story of a man who mistook his son for a destiny. And it is the story of the son who was just a boy, who was just a person, who wanted to be loved as a person rather than studied as a sign, who had to figure out, over 17 years, which part of his father's attention was love, and which part was prophecy, and whether there was enough of the first to survive the second. The Trident, 283 AC. Robert Baratheon died in the river, not poetically, not the way the songs would describe it later, the two champions meeting in single combat with the fate of a kingdom hanging on the outcome. The reality was muddier. The Trident was a battle, not a duel. Thousands of men on both sides, the water running red, the specific industrial chaos of medieval warfare, where individual heroism was mostly a matter of being in the right place when the tide turned and being skilled enough not to die when the tide turned against you. Robert and Rhaegar found each other in the ford. This part was real. The rest was embellished, but the meeting was real. Two men who hated each other for reasons that were tangled together with love and honor and politics until the tangle was indistinguishable from the hate. Robert with his warhammer, Rhaegar with his sword, rubies on the breastplate that would scatter into the river and give the ford its name. They fought. Rhaegar was the better swordsman. This was not opinion, this was the assessment of every knight who had ever seen both men fight. Rhaegar was faster, more technically proficient, the product of training that had been designed rather than accumulated. Robert was stronger, angrier, fighting with the specific fury of a man who had been told the woman he loved had been stolen, and who had converted the telling into a warhammer and a war. Fury was an advantage. Until it wasn't. Robert overcommitted. The warhammer swung wider than it should have, the arc extending past the point where the weight could be recovered, the specific mechanical failure that happened when rage overrode technique. Rhaegar stepped inside the arc. The sword found the gap in Robert's armor under the arm, the specific vulnerability that plate didn't cover, because arms needed to move, and movement required gaps. Robert went down. Not immediately. He was Robert Baratheon. He was enormous. He absorbed punishment the way mountains absorbed weather. But the wound was deep, and the blood was fast, and the river was cold. And the combination of deep wound and fast blood and cold water produced the specific medical outcome that battlefields produced when the conditions were right. He bled out. Rhaegar stood over him. He did not feel triumph. This would be misunderstood later. The songs would attribute grace to him, the noble prince who mourned his fallen enemy. It was not grace. It was the specific absence of feeling that happened when a man killed someone he didn't hate for a cause he wasn't sure was worth the killing. Robert had been a friend once. Before Lyanna. Before the politics and the prophecy and the war that the prophecy had made necessary, or that Rhaegar had made necessary by pursuing the prophecy. The distinction being the thing that would gnaw at him for the rest of his life. The battle continued for another hour. Then it stopped. Not because one side won decisively, because Robert was dead and the rebel army lost the thing that had been holding it together, which was not ideology or justice or the legitimate grievances against the Mad King, but Robert himself. The specific magnetic force of a man who could make other men want to die for him. Without Robert, the rebellion was a cause without a face, and causes without faces couldn't sustain themselves against an army with a king. The rebels surrendered. Not all at once, the Baratheon men first, then the Arryns, then, grudgingly, the Northerners. The Northerners were last because the Northerners had the most to lose. Rickard Stark burned alive, Brandon Stark strangled. The specific personal grievances that made surrender feel like betrayal rather than pragmatism. Ned Stark bent the knee. He did it on the bank of the Trident with mud on his armor and his father's sword in his hand, and the expression of a man who was doing the thing he hated most in the world, because the alternative was the destruction of his house and his people, and the specific total annihilation that Aerys would unleash on the North if the North didn't bend. Rhaegar accepted the surrender. He looked at Ned Stark, the brother of the woman he loved, the son of the man his father had burned, the living embodiment of everything the war had cost, and he wanted to say something. Something that would bridge the gap between what had happened and what needed to happen next. He said, "Your sister is safe." Ned's face did something. The mask holding and the thing behind the mask moving. The tectonic shift of a man hearing the one piece of information that mattered and receiving it from the one person he had the least reason to trust. Where? Dawn. A tower. She's... Rhaegar stopped. He didn't know how Lyanna was. He hadn't been to the tower in months. The war had kept him in the field, and the field had kept him from the woman, and the specific guilt of that, of fighting a war he'd caused instead of being with the woman he'd caused it for, was something he would carry differently once he learned what had happened at the tower while he was in the river. "She's waiting for me," Rhaegar said. She wasn't waiting for him. She was dying. The Tower of Joy, 283 AC. He rode south from the Trident with 50 men and the specific urgency of a man who had been at war for a year and who was now free to go where he should have been all along. The tower was in the mountains of Dawn. Remote, a ruin repurposed Arthur Dayne and 2 Kingsguard outside, the men Rhaegar had left to protect Lyanna, standing in the dawnish sun with their white cloaks and their swords, and the specific patience of men who had been waiting for months, and who had been expecting either their prince or an enemy, and who were relieved to see the former. Arthur met him at the base of the tower. "Your Grace," Arthur's face. Rhaegar read it, and the reading was a blade going in. Not the words, the face. Arthur Dayne did not show distress. Arthur Dayne's face was a professional instrument that had been calibrated over 20 years to display nothing that its owner did not want displayed. Arthur's face was showing distress. How long? 3 days. The maester, there's a village maester. He's been trying. Rhaegar went up the stairs. Lyanna was on the bed. The blood. The fever. The specific disaster that childbirth produced when the conditions were wrong, and the wrong was too far advanced for intervention. The midwife was there, a Dornish woman. Old, hands stained, face set in the expression of someone who had done everything available, and who knew that everything available was not enough. The baby was alive. Dark hair. Grey eyes. Stark eyes in a face that was not Targaryen. not the silver and violet that the dynasty produced. This child looked like his mother. This child looked like the North. Lyanna's hand found Rhaegar's. You came. Her voice was thread. The sound of someone using what was left. I came. Is it over? The war? It's over. Good, she looked at the baby. At Rhaegar. At the specific space between them, where the future was supposed to be the future they'd planned. The future where the war ended, and the prince returned, and the woman he loved was alive to see what came next. He's perfect. Lyanna, listen. There's no time. The grip on his hand tightened. The specific urgency of a woman who was measuring her remaining life in minutes, and who was allocating the minutes the way she allocated everything fiercely, with the full commitment of someone who did nothing by halves. His name is, I want you to name him. Something real. Not a prophecy name. Not Aegon. Not Aemon. Not any of the names that sound like destiny. A name that sounds like a person. Lyanna. Promise me. Rhaegar looked at the baby. At the grey eyes that were Lyanna's eyes. At the dark hair that was Stark hair. At the child who was, according to everything Rhaegar believed, everything the scrolls said, everything the stars had told him in the specific language that stars told things to Targaryens who knew how to listen. The prince who was promised. The song of ice and fire. The answer. Jon, he said. After nobody, just Jon. She tried to smile. The effort cost her more than the word had. A common name for a common boy. He's not common. He's a baby. Let him be a baby. Her eyes were closing. Not voluntarily, the specific involuntary surrender of a body that was done. Let him be a person first. The rest can come later. The rest. The prophecy. The destiny. The whatever it is you see when you look at him. Her grip loosened. I can see it. In your face. You're already looking at him like he's the answer. Stop. He's a baby. He's our baby. He's not an answer. Rhaegar held her hand. Promise me, Lyanna said. Promise me he gets to be a person before he has to be anything else. I promise. She died. Rhaegar held her hand until the hand was cold. The baby, Jon, cried in the midwife's arms, the universal sound of a newborn announcing its existence to a room that had just lost the person who mattered most. The sound filled the tower and went out through the windows and hit the Dornish air and disappeared the way sounds disappeared. Completely. Without remainder. Without echo. Rhaegar picked up his son. He held him. He looked at the grey eyes and he thought, the prince who was promised. He thought, just a baby. He thought both things at the same time. He would think both things at the same time for the next 17 years. The throne. What Rhaegar built. 284 AC. The Mad King was removed on a Wednesday. Not killed, removed. This was Rhaegar's specific innovation and his specific limitation. The refusal to kill his father. The court expected it. The lords expected it. Jaime Lannister, who had been standing in the throne room with his white cloak and his golden sword for months, watching Aerys burn people and listening to the screaming and counting the days until someone with authority would end it. Jaime expected it. Rhaegar didn't kill Aerys. He imprisoned him. In a tower room in the Red Keep, with maesters and guards and the specific medical attention that a man who was both king and madman required. The maesters administered milk of the poppy. The guards maintained the perimeter. The madness was contained, but not ended, and the containment was Rhaegar's way of managing the contradiction between the duty to remove a dangerous king and the inability to kill his own father. This was Rhaegar's pattern. The contradiction. The holding of two incompatible things simultaneously and committing to both rather than choosing one. He would do it again with Jon. The coronation was modest. Rhaegar did not want spectacle. Spectacle was what Aerys had wanted. Spectacle was what the Mad King had demanded. And Rhaegar's specific form of rebellion against his father was to do everything his father would have done loudly in the opposite register. Quietly. Efficiently. Without the specific performance of power that Aerys had elevated to an art form and that Rhaegar associated with the madness. The crown sat on his head. The lords bent the knee, the realm bruised, exhausted, bleeding from a war that had been fought over a prince and a girl, and the question of whether love or duty took precedence. The realm accepted him, because the alternative was chaos, and the realm had had enough chaos. Elia was at the coronation. Princess Elia Martell, Rhaegar's wife, the mother of his first two children, Rhaenys and Aegon. The boy Rhaegar had also named Aegon, because the prophecy said 3 heads, and the first Aegon was 1 head, and Jon was another, and the naming was the kind of thing that made sense if you were Rhaegar Targaryen, and that made nothing if you were anyone else. Elia stood at the coronation in the position of queen, and wore the expression of a woman who was performing a role she had not chosen, and that she was performing because the alternative divorce, exile, the political catastrophe that would befall House Martell if the Princess of Dawn refused to stand beside the Targaryen king, was worse than the performance. She hated Rhaegar. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way that hate was usually expressed in courts and castles and the specific dramatic vocabulary of Westerosi nobility. Elia hated Rhaegar in the Dornish way, which was, patiently, comprehensively, with the full awareness that the hate would be useful someday, and that usefulness was the highest form of patience. He had left her. That was the simple version. He had met Lyanna Stark at a tournament and had given her the crown of roses that should have gone to his wife, and had then, over the course of a year, left his wife and his children for a northern girl because a prophecy told him to. Because the Song of Ice and Fire required a 3rd head, and Elia's body broken by 2 difficult pregnancies. Warned by maesters that a 3rd would kill her, could not provide the 3rd head, and the 3rd head was more important to Rhaegar than his wife. Elia understood this. Understanding did not reduce the hate. Understanding provided the hate with structure, which made the hate more effective, because structured hate was hate that could be deployed at the right moment, rather than hate that consumed itself in the burning. She looked at Jon. The baby was 3 months old at the coronation, held by a wet nurse, grey eyes open and unfocused in the way that infant eyes were not seeing the world yet, just registering the light and the noise and the specific chaos of being alive and new. Elia looked at this child, her husband's son, by another woman, the child whose conception had started a war. The specific physical evidence of Rhaegar's betrayal, and felt something complicated. Not hate. Not for the baby. The baby was innocent, the baby had done nothing. The baby was a creature that existed because 2 people had made choices that the baby had no part in. Elia was Dornish, and the Dornish did not punish children for their parents' decisions. The Dornish understood that the bastard and the betrayal were different things, and that the bastard was a person, and the betrayal was a policy. She felt resignation. The specific Elia Martell resignation that she had developed over 5 years of marriage to a man who loved her, and who also loved something else more, and who could not distinguish between the 2 loves, because the second love, the prophecy love, the destiny love, had consumed the first, until the first was visible only in its absence. He has her eyes, Elia said to Rhaegar, the first time she saw Jon up close. Rhaegar looked at her. Grey. Stark grey. Elia held the baby with the competent hands of a woman who had held 2 babies of her own, and who knew how to hold an infant, without the holding becoming a performance. He looks nothing like you. He looks like his mother. She must have been striking. The conversation was a minefield, and both of them knew it, and both of them were navigating it with the specific care of 2 people who had been married for 6 years, and who had developed the ability to have dangerous conversations without detonating anything, which was itself a kind of love, even though neither of them would have called it that. He'll need a nurse. The Dornish woman who brought him, she won't stay. She's homesick already. I'll find someone. Elia, don't thank me. This isn't generosity. This is management. She handed the baby back to the wet nurse. You brought a war baby into the Red Keep. Someone has to manage the logistics of that, and it's not going to be you, because you'll be managing the kingdom. And it's not going to be Arthur Dayne, because Arthur Dayne knows how to hold a sword and not how to hold a child. She looked at him. I'll manage the child. You manage the realm. And we'll both manage the specific fiction that this arrangement is anything other than what it is. What is it? A marriage where the wife raises her husband's son by another woman because the alternative is worse, and because the child didn't choose his parents. She held his gaze. I won't love him, Rhaegar. I will raise him competently. I will keep him alive and fed and educated, and I will not punish him for your choices. But I will not love him. That's your job. I do love him. I know you do. She turned to leave. At the door. I also know you love what you think he is. and those are not the same thing. And when the difference becomes clear, and it will become clear, you're going to have to choose. She left. Rhaegar stood with the baby. He thought, she's right. He thought, she's always right. He thought, I love this child, and I also believe this child is the answer to a 1,000-year-old question, and Elia is right, that those are different things, and I cannot separate them. He held Jon. The grey eyes looked up at him. Rhaegar saw love and prophecy in the same moment, and could not tell which was which. Jon. The early years. 283, 291. Okay. Jon's first word was fire. Rhaegar told this story at court with the specific pride of a father sharing a milestone, and the court received it the way the court received everything from the king, with smiles that were performance and attention that was obligation. The story made the rounds. The king's youngest son said, fire, before he said, father. The court found this charming. Elia found it concerning. He said, fire, because you hold him next to the hearth every night. She was in the nursery, Jon's nursery, not Rhaenys and Aegon's, because Elia had arranged the nurseries on separate floors of the holdfast, and the separation was deliberate, and the deliberateness was one of the 1,000 small architectures that Elia had built to manage the situation she'd been placed in. Children learn the words they hear most. He hears fire, because you say fire, while holding him and pointing at the flames. He's drawn to it. He's an infant. Infants are drawn to bright things. It's biology, not prophecy. Rhaegar looked at her. The look was the look he gave when someone challenged the framework. Not angry, not dismissive. Something worse. Patient. The patience of a man who had been thinking about this for longer than the person he was talking to, and who believed, with the absolute certainty of someone who had spent 20 years building a worldview, that the framework was correct, and that challenges to the framework were merely challenges that the challenger hadn't thought deeply enough about. He doesn't flinch from the heat, Rhaegar said. He's 3 months old. 3-month-olds don't flinch from things because 3-month-olds don't have developed flinch responses. They develop at 6 months. Elia picked up Jon, held him with the competent practicality that she applied to everything involving the baby, not warmth, not coldness, management. When he's 6 months old and he still doesn't flinch, we can have this conversation. Until then, he's a baby, and the fire is a hearth, and you are a father who is looking for signs in a child who is too young to produce signs. Rhaegar did not argue. He did not argue, because arguing with Elia was like arguing with the tide. The tide didn't stop because you disagreed with it, and Elia didn't stop because you disputed her assessment. And the specific frustration of being married to someone who was almost always right about the things you were almost always wrong about was something Rhaegar had learned to manage through the strategy of not engaging. Jon grew. He grew in the Red Keep, in the specific environment of a royal household that was simultaneously a home and a court and a power structure and a surveillance state. He grew surrounded by people whose attention to him was never casual. The servants watched him, because the king watched him. The courtiers watched him, because watching what the king watched was how you survived at court. And the king watched him, because the king could not stop watching him. Rhaegar watched Jon the way astronomers watched stars for patterns, for significance, for the specific deviations from the ordinary that would confirm what the observer already believed. He watched Jon sleep. He watched Jon eat. He watched Jon play with the wooden blocks that Arthur Dayne had carved for him, Arthur, who had been reassigned from Kingsguard duty to Jon's personal guard, which was a reassignment that communicated to the court exactly how important the king considered this particular child. He watched and he catalogued, and the cataloguing was both fatherly attention and something else. The something else was the thing Elia saw and named, and that Rhaegar denied without conviction. Jon's first steps were at 10 months. Normal, his first word was da, directed at Rhaegar with the unfocused certainty of a toddler who had identified the important person and was announcing the identification. Rhaegar heard da and felt something break, not painfully, gently, the specific fracture that happened when a piece of armor you didn't know you were wearing fell off and the skin underneath was tender and new. He loved this boy. The love was real. The love was not the problem. The problem was that the love coexisted with the watching and the cataloguing and the specific parental surveillance that was also scholarly surveillance, that was also prophetic surveillance. And the coexistence produced a father who held his son and studied his son in the same gesture, and the son, even as an infant, even before the son had the vocabulary for it, could feel the difference between being held and being studied. Jon cried more when Rhaegar held him than when Elia held him. Elia noticed this. She did not comment on it, because commenting on it would have been cruel, and Elia was not cruel. Elia was precise. The distinction was important, and Elia maintained it with the discipline of a woman who had been given many legitimate reasons to be cruel, and who had chosen, as a matter of principle, to be precise instead. Jon stopped crying when Arthur held him. This was the unexpected development, not Rhaegar, not Elia, but Arthur. The knight, the swordsman, the man who had carved wooden blocks and who held the baby with the specific awkward competence of a warrior who had learned to modulate his grip from combat to infant, and who had discovered, to his own surprise, that the modulation came naturally. Arthur was not performing fatherhood. Arthur was not watching for signs. Arthur held Jon because Jon needed holding, and the holding was the thing complete, uncontaminated by analysis. Jon's body recognized this the way infant bodies recognized all things, through sensation, through the specific physical intelligence of a creature that couldn't think yet, but could feel. And that felt the difference between being held as a baby and being held as a prophecy. Rhaegar saw this. He saw Arthur holding his son and the son not crying, and he felt what? Jealousy was too simple. The feeling was more specific. The recognition that someone was giving his son something he couldn't give, and that the something was the absence of expectation, and that the absence of expectation was the thing his son needed most, and that Rhaegar, brilliant, prophetic, obsessed Rhaegar was constitutionally incapable of providing it. He tried. On a night in Jon's second year, a night when Elia was with Rhaenys and Aegon and Arthur was off duty, and the nursery was dark and warm and quiet, Rhaegar sat in the chair beside Jon's crib and held his sleeping son and tried to see the boy instead of the prophecy. He lasted 11 minutes. Then his mind went to the scrolls, to the Jade Compendium, to the specific passage that said born amidst salt and smoke, and the question of whether the Tower of Joy qualified as salt and smoke the dearth, or whether the conditions needed to be more literal. His mind went to the comet that had been reported in the east, and whether the timing aligned with Jon's birth. His mind went to the three-headed dragon, and whether Jon was the third head or the first, and what the distinction meant for the prophecy's fulfillment. 11 minutes. That was the longest Rhaegar could hold his son, as just his son, before the other thing, the prophecy thing, the Targaryen thing, the specific, beautiful, destructive certainty that had defined his life, and that had killed Lyanna, and that was now focused on the child Lyanna had died to produce, reasserted itself. He put Jon down. He went to his study. He read the scrolls. The pattern established itself, and the pattern held, and the pattern was, Rhaegar loved his son, and Rhaegar studied his son, and the two activities occupied the same space and the same time, and the son growing, developing, becoming a person who could sense things even before he could articulate them. The son felt both. The siblings. 288 AC. Rhaenys was 7 years older than Jon. She was, by every measure the court applied, the perfect Targaryen princess. Silver-haired, violet-eyed, carrying the Martell warmth underneath the Targaryen composure. She was bright and curious, and she had the specific quality of a child who had been loved correctly. By Elia, who loved her children the way she did everything, which was competently and without condition. Rhaenys liked Jon. This complicated Elia's management of the situation, because Elia's management relied on the separate nurseries and the separate schedules and the specific architectural distance between Jon's life and her children's lives, and Rhaenys kept collapsing the distance by going to Jon's nursery and playing with him and bringing him her things. Toys, books, the small accumulated possessions of a 7-year-old who had decided that the baby in the other nursery was interesting, and who did not care about the political architecture that was supposed to keep them apart. "He's my brother," Rhaenys said, when Elia tried, gently with the Elia touch that was never harsh but was always clear, to redirect her. "He's your half-brother. What's the difference?" "The difference is complicated." "Complicated how?" Elia looked at her daughter. 7 years old. The age of questions that didn't have answers, that fit into 7-year-old vocabulary. The specific Rhaenys quality of going directly at a thing and expecting a direct response, which was Dornish and which Elia would normally have encouraged, and which was, in this instance, leading into territory that Elia did not want to map for a child. His mother was different from your mother. I know. His mother died. Yes. So he needs more people. Because he doesn't have a mother, and I have a mother, and father is... Rhaenys paused. The pause of a 7-year-old processing something she'd been observing for years and was now ready to articulate. Father is weird with him. Elia's eyebrows rose. He looks at Jon funny. Not mean funny. Just like Jon is a book father is trying to read. He doesn't look at me like that. Or Egg. Egg was Rhaenys' name for Aegon, the diminutive that the family used and that the court would never be permitted to use. He looks at us like we're his children. He looks at Jon like Jon is a thing. Elia sat on the bed. She looked at her daughter, she thought. 7 years old, and she sees it. 7 years old, and she's identified the thing I've been managing for 5 years, and she's named it with the brutal simplicity that children had, because children hadn't learnt the vocabulary of evasion. Your father loves Jon. I know. Your father also has ideas about Jon. About what Jon is supposed to become. What's he supposed to become? That's the part I can't explain yet. It's your father believes in things. Old things. Prophecies. Stories from before the conquest. He believes Jon is important. In a way that goes beyond being a prince. Like a hero? Like Aegon the Conqueror? Something like that. But bigger. Elia chose her words. And the believing changes how he sees Jon, and he sees the believing at the same time, and the believing is it's louder than the seeing. So Jon gets the believing instead of the seeing. Rhaenys processed this. That's sad. Yes. Can I be the seeing, since father is the believing? Elia looked at her daughter. Yes. She said. You can be the seeing. Rhaenys went to Jon's nursery. Jon was 5. He was sitting on the floor with the wooden blocks Arthur had carved, building a tower. The tower was careful, not the random stacking of a 5-year-old, but the deliberate construction of a child who had been watching architecture and who was reproducing it with the specific intensity of a boy who took building seriously. Rhaenys sat beside him. What are you building? A tower. It's good. The top is too heavy. He frowned at the blocks. If I put the big one on top, it falls. But it looks right with the big one on top. Then put the big one in the middle, where it's strong enough to hold it, but it doesn't have to hold anything else. Jon looked at her, 5 years old, grey eyes, the expression of a child encountering a solution he hadn't considered. He put the big block in the middle. The tower stood. I'm Rhaenys, she said. I'm your sister. I know. I'm going to come here every day. Okay. And we're going to build things. Okay. She came every day. They built things. Aegon, young Aegon, Egg, the boy who was 3 years older than Jon, and who had been named for a conqueror, and who was, by temperament, the least conquering person in the Red Keep, Aegon, came too. Not every day. Aegon was shy the specific Targaryen introversion that skipped generations and that had produced Rhaegar's own bookish childhood. Aegon preferred the library to the nursery, and the library to the yard, and the library to most rooms, because the library was the one place in the Red Keep where nobody expected him to be princely. But he came. When Rhaenys dragged him. When the guilt of not being present overcame the comfort of not being present. When the specific sibling gravity that connected the three of them, connected them despite the separate nurseries and the separate mothers, and the specific political architecture that was supposed to keep them at arm's length, pulled him from the stacks to the floor where Jon and Rhaenys were building things. Jon and Aegon did not bond easily. This was the complicated part. Jon and Rhaenys were immediate the chemistry was there. The 7-year-old and the infant who became the 12-year-old and the 5-year-old who built towers together. The relationship forming fast and strong the way relationships formed between people who recognized each other on sight. Jon and Aegon were work. Aegon was careful with Jon. Careful in the way that children were careful with things they didn't understand. Aegon was Elia's son in his bones. He had absorbed his mother's management of the Jon situation without being told about it. The specific osmotic transfer of parental tension to child behavior that happened in every household and that happened in the Red Keep with the additional pressure of being royal. Aegon knew that Jon was different. Not in the way that Rhaenys knew. Rhaenys saw the difference and loved through it. Aegon saw the difference and was cautious about it. Because Aegon had heard not from Alia, not directly, but from the household, from the servants, from the ambient noise of a court that processed every piece of information about the royal family and produced opinions that filtered down to the children through the specific social osmosis of castle life, that Jon was the reason his mother was unhappy. Jon was not the reason his mother was unhappy. Rhaegar was the reason his mother was unhappy. But the distinction was too sophisticated for an 8-year-old, and the result was Aegon was careful with Jon the way you were careful with something you didn't want to break, and that you also, in some unarticulated place, resented for existing. Jon felt this. Jon felt everything. This was the thing about Jon, the specific quality that Arthur noticed first, and that Rhaenys noticed second, and that Rhaegar, despite his watching, despite his cataloguing, despite his constant surveillance, somehow missed. Jon felt the emotional temperature of every room he entered. He knew when Rhaegar was watching him as a son, and when Rhaegar was watching him as a subject. He knew when Alia was managing him, and when Alia was genuine. He knew when Aegon was cautious, and he adjusted, pulled back, gave space. Did the specific emotional labor of a 5-year-old managing someone else's resentment that 5-year-olds should not have had to do. Arthur saw all of this. Arthur saw it because Arthur was standing in the room, literally, physically. The Kingsguard knight assigned to the prince's youngest son, standing at the wall with his white cloak and his perfect posture and his eyes that missed nothing, because missing things in the Red Keep was how people died. Arthur saw the father watching the son for signs. Arthur saw the son watching the father for safety. Arthur saw the gap between them, the gap that was shaped like a prophecy. The gap that grew wider with every year that Rhaegar studied the scrolls, and every year that Jon grew into a person rather than a prediction. Arthur thought, this is going to break. He didn't know when, but the architecture of the situation, the father's obsession, the son's sensitivity, the wife's patience, the siblings' complicated love, had a structural flaw. And the structural flaw was Rhaegar himself. And the flaw was going to produce a failure, and the failure was going to be spectacular. He stood at the wall. He watched. He waited. Rhaegar and Ned. The Peace. 286 AC. Ned Stark came to King's Landing 3 years after the war. He came because the peace required it. The specific diplomatic maintenance that followed a rebellion, the visits and the audiences, and the performative submission that the defeated were required to enact, and that the victorious were required to witness. Ned came with a small retinue. 20 men, northern, wearing the stark grey, with the specific, understated pride of men who had lost a war, and who were not going to apologize for having fought it. Rhaegar received him in the throne room. Not on the Iron Throne. Rhaegar avoided the throne when possible, receiving audiences from a chair at the base of the dais, because sitting on the throne meant sitting where his father had sat, and the sitting produced a specific discomfort that was not physical, but psychological. Rhaegar sat at the base, and Ned stood before him, and the room was full of the specific charged distance between two men who were connected by a dead woman and who had never spoken about her directly. Lord Stark, Your Grace. The formalities, the performance of normalcy between a king and a defeated lord. The court watched with the specific, rapt attention of an audience that knew the subtext and was waiting for the subtext to surface. The subtext did not surface. They discussed the North, the rebuilding, the taxes, the specific logistics of reintegrating a kingdom that had rebelled and that needed to be brought back into the realm's economic and political structure without the producing a second rebellion. Rhaegar was good at this. Rhaegar was good at governance the way he was good at everything that involved planning and thinking and the long view, the specific competencies that made him an excellent king and a complicated father. The audience ended. The court dispersed. Then Rhaegar invited Ned to his solar. Privately, without the court, without the performance. The solar was the room where Rhaegar worked, not the throne room, not the small council chamber, the private room where the scrolls were and the maps were, and the specific accumulated evidence of a king who thought more than he spoke, and who needed a room where the thinking could happen without witnesses. Ned came. They looked at each other without the court between them, and the looking was different, rawer, the performance stripped away. Your nephew is well, Rhaegar said. Ned's jaw tightened. Jon, he's 3. He's healthy. Arthur watches him. Arthur Dayne watches him. Arthur is the best Arthur Dayne. Ned's voice was even, but the evenness was work. The Kingsguard who stood outside the Tower of Joy while my sister died inside it. Rhaegar absorbed this. The way he absorbed difficult things without visible reaction. The internal processing happening behind a face that was trained to betray nothing. She asked for him. At the end, she asked me to name the boy something real. Something that wasn't a prophecy. Did you? Jon? Jon? Ned tasted the name. After no one. She wanted a name that sounded like a person, not a dynasty. Ned was quiet for a moment. You called your first son Aegon. Yes, and your plan was to call this one Aegon too. The prophecy. Ned's voice went somewhere cold. The specific northern cold that was not raised volume but lowered temperature. The stark method of communicating fury through frost. The prophecy that started a war. The prophecy that killed my father and my brother. The prophecy that he stopped. The prophecy that my sister died for. Lyanna didn't die for the prophecy. Lyanna died in a tower in Dawn while you were fighting a war that you started because of a prophecy. The distinction you're drawing is Ned stopped again. He was a man who chose his words, and the choosing was costing him. Bin. Rhaegar looked at his hands. I know what the war cost. You know what it cost you. You don't know what it cost us. Ned leaned forward. My father burned alive in this castle. In that room, he pointed toward the throne room. My brother strangled himself trying to save him. I fought a war I didn't want, because your father's madness didn't leave me a choice, and your disappearance with my sister didn't leave me a reason to not fight. He held the gaze. And now I'm here. In this castle. Bending the knee to you. Because you won, and I lost, and that's how the game works. It's not a game. It's always a game. Your father played it with fire. You play it with prophecy. The game doesn't change, because the player changes. The board is the same. Rhaegar was quiet. Can I see him? The question landed differently than everything else. Stripped of the politics and the grievance and the specific accumulated pain of 3 years of defeated lordship. A man asking to see his sister's child. Yes now? Now, Rhaegar brought Ned to the nursery. Jon was on the floor, 3 years old, dark hair, building with the blocks Arthur had carved. He looked up when the door opened and saw Rhaegar, and his face did the thing that Jon's face did when Rhaegar entered the split-second assessment of which version of his father was arriving. The father, or the watcher. Then Jon saw Ned. He looked at the stranger, tall, dark-haired, grey-eyed, northern in every line of him, and his face did something else. Something new. Recognition. Not the recognition of a face he'd seen before he hadn't seen Ned. This was their first meeting. Recognition of type. Category. The specific visual and atmospheric recognition of a child seeing someone who looked like himself for the first time. Dark hair. Grey eyes. The stark colouring that Jon carried, and that nobody else in the Red Keep shared. Jon stared at Ned. Ned stared at Jon. He looks like her, Ned said. Not to Rhaegar. To the air. To the room. To the absence. He looks exactly like Lyanna. Jon stood up. Walked to Ned with the unsteady confidence of a 3-year-old crossing a room. Stood in front of him. Who are you? I'm your uncle. Jon looked at him. 3 years old. Processing. Then, you have my eyes. Ned crouched. Brought himself to the boy's level. You have your mother's eyes. My mother is dead. I know. Father says she was brave. Ned's face. The mask breaking, not dramatically. Not in the theatrical way of songs and stories, but in the small, human way of a man encountering something that hit him harder than he was prepared for. She was the bravest person I ever knew. Jon considered this. Then he offered Ned a wooden block. Do you want to build? Ned took the block. They built. Rhaegar watched from the doorway and felt something he could not name, something between gratitude and grief, and the specific recognition that his son had just connected with someone in a way that Jon didn't connect with him. And that the connection was effortless. And that the effortlessness was the thing Rhaegar couldn't provide, because the effort, the watching, the cataloguing, the prophecy was always there between Rhaegar and his son, the invisible architecture of expectation that Jon could feel but couldn't see, and that made every interaction with his father carry a weight that interactions with strangers didn't carry. Ned stayed for 3 days. When he left, Jon cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, the quiet crying of a 3-year-old who had found something and lost it in the span of 3 days, and who didn't have the vocabulary to explain what he'd found, but who could feel its absence. Rhaegar held him. Jon cried harder. Arthur took him. Jon stopped. Rhaegar watched this from the doorway of the nursery, and the watching was the most painful watching he'd ever done. Worse than the trident. Worse than the tower. Because this watching was not the watching of a tragedy that was done, but the watching of a tragedy that was ongoing, and that was shaped like himself. The training. 291-296 AC. Arthur trained Jon. This was Rhaegar's decision, and it was, Elia would acknowledge this later, the best decision Rhaegar made regarding his son's development. Not because Arthur was the finest swordsman alive, although he was. Because Arthur did not look at Jon and see a prophecy. Arthur looked at Jon and saw a boy who needed to learn to fight, and the seeing was clean, and Jon could feel the cleanness, and the feeling allowed Jon to be a student rather than a subject. They started when Jon was 8. The practice yard at the Red Keep, the same yard where Rhaegar had trained, where Jaime Lannister had trained, where generations of Targaryen princes had learned the sword under the specific Kingsguard method that prioritized discipline over inspiration and that produced fighters who were technically excellent and emotionally contained. Jon was not emotionally contained. This was the surprise. Jon looked like a Stark. The grey eyes, the dark hair, the northern colouring that stood out in the Red Keep like a crow in a field of herons. And people expected him to fight like a Stark. Stoic, enduring, the northern method of absorbing punishment and outlasting the opponent through sheer refusal to stop. Jon fought like a storm, the Targaryen blood, the fire that the ice concealed. When Jon picked up a practice sword and entered the yard, the thing that emerged was not the patient northern fighter, but something faster and more aggressive and fundamentally less controlled. Jon attacked, Jon pressed, Jon found the gap and went through it with a speed that was not trained but innate, the neurological quickness that lived in the Targaryen bloodline alongside the madness and the prophecy and the specific genetic unpredictability that the dynasty had been producing for 300 years. Arthur managed this. Not by suppressing it. Arthur understood that suppressing the fire would produce either a fighter who was less than he could be, or a person whose suppressed energy found other outlets, and the other outlets were historically problematic in Targaryens. Instead, Arthur channeled it. He taught Jon to use the fire inside the structure, to let the aggression fuel the technique rather than replace it, to burn hot inside a framework of cold precision. The combination was devastating. By 10, Jon was beating boys 3 years older. Not through size. Jon was small for 10, the Targaryen frame that would develop into something lean and quick, but that at 10 was just small. Through speed and timing, and the specific ability to see an opening and exploit it before the opening closed. By 12, he was beating grown men, the household guard, the junior knights, the specific population of trained fighters that the Red Keep maintained, and that served as sparring partners for the royal children. By 14, he was Arthur's assessment, delivered to Rhaegar in the specific flat tone that Arthur used when stating facts rather than opinions, the third best fighter in the Red Keep. Third, behind me and Sir Barristan. He'll pass Barristan within the year. Barristan is 62. And you? Arthur looked at Rhaegar. That depends on whether his patience develops. He's faster than me already. Stronger? No, that comes later, but fast enough that the strength gap doesn't matter if he times it right. He paused. His weakness is the same as yours. What weakness? Certainty. He commits before the opening is confirmed. He sees what he thinks is the gap, and he goes, and most of the time he's right, and the going works. But the times he's wrong, the times the gap closes while he's moving through it, those times will kill him. Rhaegar heard this. He heard it as a father, and he heard it as a king, and he heard it as a man who had spent his own life committing to openings that he believed were there, the prophecy. The war, the tower, the specific chain of decisions that had been made with certainty and that had cost everything. Can you fix it? I can train it. Fixing. Arthur looked at the yard where Jon was cooling down, the sweat drying in the King's Landing heat, the 14-year-old body vibrating with the specific post-training energy that young fighters had and that dissipated into the atmosphere like heat from a forge. Fixing requires something I can't provide. Fixing requires the boy to learn patience from a source he trusts. He trusts you. He trusts me to train him. He doesn't trust me to Arthur stopped. Chose his words with the care of a man about to say something to his king that his king did not want to hear. He doesn't trust anyone to know him. Not fully. He performs trust with me, with Rhaenys, with Elia. He doesn't perform trust with you, because he can't perform around you. You see through the performance. But the trust itself, the real thing, the unguarded thing, I haven't seen it. Why not? Arthur looked at Rhaegar. The look was the closest Arthur came to saying the thing directly, which was, because you taught him that being known is being studied, and being studied is being used, and being used is the condition of his existence in this household. And the boy has learned without being taught, without being told, that the safest position in a room full of people who want something from him is the position where nobody can see the real him. Arthur didn't say this. He said, he's 14. 14-year-olds don't trust. It's developmental. Rhaegar accepted this because accepting it was easier than accepting the alternative. Jon trained. He trained every morning in the yard and every afternoon in the library because Rhaegar had insisted on the library. Because Rhaegar believed that the prince who was promised needed to understand the prophecy as well as fulfill it, and the understanding required reading. Jon read. He read the histories. He read the prophecies, the Jade Compendium, the scrolls of Ashai, the specific, dense, apocalyptic literature that Rhaegar had been consuming since his own childhood, and that Rhaegar had curated into a curriculum for his son, the way a poison master curated a curriculum for an apprentice, starting with the mild doses and working up to the lethal. Jon read it. And he understood it, and he did not believe it. This was the thing Rhaegar missed, the thing he missed, because he was looking for signs of the prophecy's fulfillment rather than signs of the prophecy's rejection. Jon read the prophecy, and he understood the argument, and he found the argument unconvincing. Not the existence of the threat, the Night King, the army of the dead, the long night that was coming. Jon found the threat credible. What he found unconvincing was the solution, that a single person, born under the right conditions, carrying the right blood, fulfilling the right conditions, would save the world through the specific mechanism of being destined to save it. Jon believed in problems and solutions, not in destiny. This was the Stark in him. The North. The specific practical worldview that Ned Stark had transmitted in 3 days of building with wooden blocks, and that had taken root in Jon's architecture more deeply than anything Rhaegar had transmitted in 14 years of prophecy lectures. Problems had solutions. Destiny had martyrs. Jon did not want to be a martyr. He did not tell Rhaegar this. He didn't tell Rhaegar this, because telling Rhaegar this would have required a conversation that Jon was not ready to have, the conversation about what Jon actually believed versus what Jon performed believing. The gap between the son Rhaegar saw and the son Jon was. The gap was growing. Arthur saw it. Elia saw it. Rhaenys saw it with the specific sibling clarity of a 21-year-old woman watching her 14-year-old brother build a wall around himself, and knowing what the wall was made of, and knowing that the wall was going to produce a crisis, and that the crisis was going to hurt everyone in the family when it came. Rhaenys went to Jon. She found him in the library, his space. The one room in the Red Keep where Jon felt something approaching peace. The room where the books were static and the expectations were low, and the only person watching him was Arthur, who watched without watching, who stood at the wall and read his own book and let Jon read his. You don't believe it. Jon looked up. The prophecy. The prince who was promised. Azor Ahai, the whole thing. Rhaenys sat across from him. 21, silver-haired. Elia's eyes in Rhaegar's face. The specific Martell warmth that made her the member of the family who could say true things without the true things feeling like attacks. You don't believe it. I believe the threat is real. That's not what I asked. Jon closed the book. I believe there's something beyond the wall. I believe the watch reports are accurate. I believe the cold is coming, and it's going to be bad. I believe all of that. He held her gaze. I don't believe I'm the answer to it because I was born under a bleeding star, or because my blood is the right temperature. Have you told Father? No. Why not? Because telling Father would require explaining that I've spent 14 years reading his prophecy, and I think the prophecy is wrong. Not the prediction, the mechanism. The prediction says the long night is coming. Fine. The mechanism says a single person with the right blood saves the world through destiny. He searched for the word. That's religion. Not strategy. Strategy. Problems have solutions. Solutions require resources and planning and the specific application of effort to conditions. That's strategy. Destiny is, the right person exists, and the existing is the solution. He shook his head. That's not how the world works. That's how stories work. Rhaenys looked at him. You sound like Uncle Ned. I met Uncle Ned once. For 3 days. When I was 3, you sound like him anyway. Maybe the blood knows. Or maybe you've been reading more than the prophecy scrolls. Rhaenys looked at the book he'd been reading, not a prophecy text. A military history. The campaigns of the first men against the others during the Long Night, written by a maester from the Citadel who had attempted, with the dry precision of academic scholarship, to reconstruct the military logistics of an 8,000-year-old war. You're studying the last Long Night. The actual one. Not the prophecy version, the tactical version. How they fought. What worked. What didn't. Jon opened the book again. The first men didn't win because of a prince who was promised. They won because they built a wall, and manned it, and developed weapons dragonglass. Valyrian steel that worked against the dead. They won through engineering and logistics, and the specific stubborn refusal to die that is not a prophecy, but a strategy. Father won't like this. I know. You're going to have to tell him eventually. I know. When? When I have something to replace the prophecy with. When I can say, this is the plan. Not, the prophecy is wrong. But, here's what we do instead. Rhaenys looked at her brother. Her half-brother. Her little brother. The boy with the grey eyes who had been born in a tower to a dying woman, and who had been studied his entire life by a father who couldn't see him clearly, and who was now, at 14, building an alternative framework for saving the world in the library of the Red Keep, while his father read prophecy scrolls 2 floors above. You're going to break his heart. I know. And you're going to be right. I think so. Both of those things are true, and neither of them makes the other one easier. I know. She left. Jon went back to his book. Arthur, at the wall, looked at Jon over the top of his own book. He thought, the crisis is coming. He turned the page. Elia and Jon. The conversation, 295, icy. Jon went to Elia when he was 12. Not to Rhaegar, to Elia. This was itself a statement, a choice, the specific 12-year-old's calculation about which parent figure would give him the honest answer, and which would give him the prophecy answer. He found her in the gardens, the Dornish corner of the Red Keep's gardens, where Elia had cultivated plants from the south. Blood oranges, lemon trees, the specific botanical homesickness of a woman who had been in King's Landing for 13 years, and who maintained a piece of dawn in the capital, the way exiles maintained pieces of home. Through effort, through denial of the distance, through the daily tending of something that shouldn't survive here, and that survived anyway, because the tending wouldn't stop. Can I ask you something? Elia was pruning a lemon tree. The pruning was therapy, the methodical removal of what didn't serve the tree, the specific act of cutting that was also an act of care. You can ask me anything. Whether I answer depends on the question. Am I... He stopped. Started again. 12-year-olds had the vocabulary for some questions and not others, and this question was in the not others category. Father looks at me and he sees something. Not me. Something else. Something in me. And the something is more interesting to him than the me. Elia set down the shears. I know what the prophecy says. Jon sat on the garden wall. I've read the scrolls. Prince who was promised. Song of ice and fire. 3 heads of the dragon. I know what he thinks I am. What do you think you are? I'm me. I like reading. I like training. I like it when Arthur shows me something new, and I can feel it click the footwork or the timing, the moment where the body does the thing before the mind tells it to. He looked at his hands. I like building things. Not important things. Just things. Structures. Puzzles. I like seeing how things fit together. And the prophecy? The prophecy says I'm supposed to save the world. That I'm supposed to be the answer to a question that's been asked for 1,000 years. He looked at her. And I read the question, and I understand the question, and I think the question is real. Something is coming. Something from the north. Something bad. But the answer isn't a person. The answer is, I don't know what the answer is. But it's not one boy with the right parents. Elia looked at him. 12 years old. Grey eyes. The specific earnest intensity of a child wrestling with something that most adults couldn't articulate, and that this child was articulating with a clarity that was either precocious or Targaryen, or both. You're asking me whether your father's view of you is correct. I'm asking you whether he stopped. I'm asking whether it's possible to love someone and still see them wrong. Aaliyah's face did something that her face rarely did in Jon's presence. It softened. Not the softness of warmth, the softness of recognition. The specific expression of a woman who had spent 13 years being loved and seen wrong by the same man, and who recognized the experience in the child she'd raised. Yes, it's possible. It's common. Among Targaryens. Among people with big ideas. Among men who believe deeply in things. Your father loves you. I have never doubted that. I have resented him for many things, but not for the love. The love is real. But the love and the seeing are different operations. Your father loves you, and he sees the prophecy. He does both at the same time. And the prophecy is louder. Because the prophecy was there before you, or the prophecy has been with your father since he was 14 and first read the Jade Compendium. And you've been with your father since you were born, and the 14-year head start means the prophecy is installed. In a deeper layer. Harder to override. Can it be overridden? By you. Maybe. Nobody else has managed it, not me. Not Arthur, not Rhaenys. Because we're not the prophecy. We can't tell the prophecy it's wrong, because we're not the subject of the prophecy. You are. She picked up the shears. When you're ready, and you'll know when you're ready. Because the readiness will feel like rage and certainty. At the same time, tell your father the prophecy is wrong. Not about the threat, about the mechanism. Tell him the mechanism is not a prince with a magic sword. Tell him the mechanism is whatever you've figured out by then. Because you will figure something out. You're your father's son. In that regard, the intelligence is genetic. The difference is what you'll do with it. What will I do with it? Something practical. Something that involves logistics rather than destiny. Something, she smiled, the Elias smile that was rare in Jon's presence. And that was, when it appeared, the most beautiful smile in the Red Keep, because it was the most controlled and the most genuine simultaneously. Something that makes a terrible song. Jon almost smiled. Go train, Elias said. The answer to your father isn't ready yet. It'll be ready when you've seen the thing yourself, the threat, the north, the cold. Until then, train, read, build your towers from blocks. She looked at the lemon tree. And when the answer comes, when you stand in front of your father and tell him the prophecy is wrong, remember that the telling is going to break something in him. And breaking things in the people you love it's necessary sometimes. But it's never free. Jon left. Elia pruned the tree. She thought, 13 years of raising a child who isn't mine has produced this. A 12-year-old who comes to me for the truth because his father gives him the prophecy. She thought, that's the cruelest thing about Rhaegar. Not the betrayal. Not the war. Not Lyanna. The cruelest thing is that he loves this boy so much that the love has become a cage, and the boy has come to the woman who has every reason to hate him and asked her for the key. She thought, I don't hate him. This was the surprise. 13 years. 13 years of managing the rage and the resignation and the specific daily indignity of raising her husband's son by another woman. And the result was, she didn't hate the boy. She didn't love him. She had been honest about that. She didn't love him. But she didn't hate him. She had raised him competently, and the competence had, over 13 years, produced something adjacent to affection, and the adjacency was enough. She pruned the tree. The tree grew. Rhaegar, what the obsession produced. 296, 298 Equinus. Rhaegar's obsession deepened the way obsessions deepened. Not dramatically, not with a specific triggering event, but through the gradual accumulation of certainty that calcified into something that looked like wisdom and felt like imprisonment. He read more. He slept less. He spent hours in his solar with the scrolls and the maps and the specific collected evidence of 1,000 years of prophecy, arranging and rearranging the pieces, the way Jon arranged the building blocks, trying to make the picture resolve into something actionable. The picture did not resolve. This was the frustration, the Targaryen frustration, the specific intellectual agony of a brilliant man working on a problem that might not be solvable, because the problem might not be a problem at all, might be a story, a metaphor, a myth that had been mistaken for prediction by generation after generation of Targaryens who wanted the myth to be real, because the realness gave their blood a purpose beyond the political. Rhaegar wanted his blood to have a purpose. This was the thing underneath the prophecy, the thing that drove it, that had always driven it. Not altruism, not the desire to save the world. Identity, the specific Rhaegar question that had been with him since childhood. Why am I this? Why this blood? Why these dreams? Why the fire in the blood, and the ice and the visions, and the specific feeling that I am not chosen? That was too dramatic, that I am relevant? That the blood is relevant? That the existing is not accidental, but purposeful? The prophecy answered the question. The prophecy said, your blood matters, because your blood produces the prince who saves the world. The answer was comforting and total, and it had organized Rhaegar's life for 20 years, and the organizing had produced a war, a dead woman, a living son, a kingdom, a marriage he damaged, a father he deposed, and the specific ongoing uncertainty of a man who had bet everything on a thesis he couldn't test. He talked to Jon about it. Not constantly. Rhaegar was not ham-fisted about the prophecy, was not the kind of father who lectured his son over breakfast about destiny. He was subtler than that, worse than that. He wove the prophecy into the fabric of their interactions, the way you wove thread into cloth, individual threads invisible, the pattern emerging only when you stepped back and saw the whole. The dreams, Rhaegar said to Jon on a Thursday evening. In the solar, the scrolls spread between them. Jon was 15. The conversations had been happening for years, the evening sessions. The father and son time that was also the king and prophecy time. The dual-purpose interaction that Jon navigated with the specific exhausted grace of a teenager managing a parent's expectations. What about them? Are they still the fire? The ice? I dream about wolves sometimes. Jon didn't look up from the book he was reading, not a prophecy book, a history of the Night's Watch. The kind of text Rhaegar considered secondary and Jon considered primary. A white wolf. In the snow. Wolves. Rhaegar's voice was neutral in the way that Rhaegar's voice went neutral when he was processing information that didn't fit the framework. Not dragons? Wolves. The prophecy speaks of. I know what the prophecy speaks of. Jon closed the book, not with anger, with the controlled firmness of a 15-year-old who had been having this conversation in various forms for his entire life, and who had developed the specific technique of ending it without escalating it. Father, I dream about wolves. Stark dreams. Northern dreams. I'm half Stark. The dreams are going to be half Northern. The three heads of the dragon are a symbol. Maybe. Or a prediction. Or a metaphor that's been translated through 14 languages and 8,000 years of textual transmission, and that might not mean what the current translation says it means. He held Rhaegar's gaze. I've been reading the source texts. The original Valyrian. The translation that everyone uses, the Jade Compendium, is a translation of a paraphrase. 3 layers of interpretation between the original and what we're reading. Rhaegar went still. The original says the dragon must have 3 fires, not 3 heads. Fires. The word is Dracarys ill, which can mean heads or fires or births, or the Valyrian is ambiguous. The translation chose heads because the translator was working from a manuscript that was damaged and heads fit the context. But fires is equally valid and changes the interpretation completely. Rhaegar looked at his son. He looked at Jon with the specific expression of a man who has been pursuing a thesis for 20 years and who is hearing from his own child, from the prince who was supposed to be the thesis's proof, that the thesis might be built on a mistranslation. Where did you learn Valyrian? Maester Aemon at the Wall is a Targaryen. He corresponds with me. We've been exchanging letters for 3 years. Jon held the gaze. He reads the original texts. He says the prophecy is his word useful. Not true, useful. As a framework for thinking about the threat, not as a blueprint for the response. Maester Aemon, your great uncle. He's 100 years old, and he's been reading these prophecies longer than you've been alive, and his conclusion is, the threat is real. The solution is not a person. Jon leaned forward. Father, I believe the long night is coming. I believe the threat from the north is real. I believe the Night's Watch reports. I've been studying the military history of the First Long Night, and the engineering of the wall, and the properties of dragonglass and Valyrian steel. I believe in the problem. And the solution? The solution is not me. The solution is not one person with the right blood. The solution is armies. Dragonglass, steel, the wall, reinforced. The watch, the specific, boring, logistical preparation that wins wars. Not a prophecy that says a prince will wave his magic sword and the darkness will retreat. Rhaegar sat back. The study was full of the specific heavy silence that happened when a father heard his son articulate a worldview that was fundamentally different from his own, and that was the father could see this, could feel this, could acknowledge this, even as the acknowledging was painful, well argued. You've been preparing this. I've been preparing an alternative. Not a rejection of your concern, the concern is correct. Something is coming from the north. We need to prepare. The disagreement is about how we prepare. How? Resources, not prophecy. Men, steel, dragonglass, send to Dragonstone. The obsidian deposits there are massive. Mine them. Arm the watch. Reinforce the wall. Build the response the way the first men built it, through engineering and logistics, and the specific stubborn application of effort to conditions. Jon held the gaze. Not through destiny, through work. Rhaegar looked at his son. He saw for a moment, for a fraction of a moment, what everyone else saw when they looked at Jon. A boy, a person, not a prophecy. A 15-year-old with grey eyes and dark hair and opinions that were his own, and that were informed by 3 years of correspondence with a centenarian maester at the wall, and that were backed by research and analysis and the specific quality of thinking that Rhaegar himself valued above all other quality. For a fraction of a moment, Rhaegar saw his son. Then the prophecy came back. The prophecy was a tide. It receded and it returned, and the returning was inevitable because the prophecy was not an idea Rhaegar held, but a structure Rhaegar lived inside, the architecture of his entire life. And stepping outside the architecture required a demolition that Rhaegar was not prepared to perform. The prophecy is not a mistranslation, Rhaegar said. The prophecy is, I've read the originals too. I've read every version in every language. The weight of the evidence suggests that smart people have been interpreting ambiguous texts for 1,000 years and producing confident answers that contradict each other. Jon stood. Father, I love you. I respect your intelligence. I do not share your certainty. And the gap between your certainty and my doubt it's the gap. He looked at Rhaegar. The gap has been there my whole life. You look at me and you see the answer. I look at me and I see a person. And until you can see the person, the gap is going to stay. He left. Rhaegar sat in the study. He sat with the scrolls and the prophecy and the specific weight of a conversation that had told him what everyone in the household had been trying to tell him for 15 years, and that he had been unable to hear because the prophecy was louder than the telling. He sat for a long time. He did not change his mind. This was the tragedy. Not that Rhaegar was stupid. Rhaegar was the opposite of stupid, was brilliant, was the most intellectually gifted king the realm had seen since Jaehaerys I. The tragedy was that the brilliance was in service of a conviction that the brilliance couldn't question, because questioning the conviction required dismantling the identity, and dismantling the identity was the one thing the brilliance couldn't do. The brilliant man couldn't examine himself. The 15-year-old could. That was the gap. Arthur. What the Night Carried. 298 AC. Arthur Dayne stood guard outside Jon's chambers and thought about the things he'd carried. 15 years. The Kingsguard oath that he'd kept and broken and kept again in different forms. The sword Dawn on his back. The pale blade that had been in his family for 8,000 years and that he carried now, not for a king, but for a boy. The specific daily weight of watching a father fail his son in the most loving way possible. He had watched Rhaegar study Jon in the cradle. He had watched the studying intensify through the years, the prophecy lens getting thicker, the sun getting less visible behind it. He had watched Jon develop the specific coping mechanism of performing what Rhaegar wanted to see while hiding what Jon actually was. The 12-year-old version of a survival strategy that should not have been necessary in a household where the child was loved. Arthur carried the irony of this like a stone. The boy was loved. That was the thing. This was not a story of a father who didn't love his son. This was a story of a father who loved his son so much that the love became indistinguishable from obsession, and the obsession consumed. The love the way fire consumed the fuel that produced it. Arthur had tried to compensate. The morning sessions, the sparring, the sword work that was Arthur understood this, had always understood this, not just training. The morning sessions were the one time in Jon's day when someone looked at him as a person rather than a prophecy. Arthur looked at Jon and saw a boy with good footwork and a tendency to commit too early, and who needed to learn patience, and who was, in the specific professional assessment of a man who had been the best swordsman in the world for 20 years, extraordinary. Not because of the prophecy, because of the work, the repetition, the 10,000 swings, the getting hit and getting up, the specific daily grind of becoming something through effort rather than through blood. The blood helped. Arthur wasn't blind to that the speed was genetic, the aggression was genetic. The specific fire that emerged when Jon fought was Targaryen in origin and would have been there regardless of training. But the skill, the precision, the economy, the reading of an opponent that was built, Arthur had built it, swing by swing, morning by morning, for 15 years. And now the boy was going north. Arthur would go with him because going with Jon was what Arthur did. Not because of the oath. The Kingsguard oath was a framework that Arthur maintained out of institutional habit, and that had been superseded, years ago, by something more personal. He went with Jon because Jon was the thing Arthur had built. Not the prophecy, not the prince, the boy, the person, the specific human being who had grey eyes and dark hair, and who ate too fast, and who still, at 15, left his practice swords in the yard the way he had at 5. Arthur carried many things. The weight of the sword, the weight of the oath, the weight of 15 years of watching a father and a son miss each other by the width of a prophecy. He stood outside the chamber. He waited. Waiting was what knights did. Standing and waiting and being ready for the thing that might come, and that you couldn't predict, and that the readiness was for. He was ready. The North. 298 Jon asked to go north. Not requested. Asked. The distinction was important in the Red Keep, where the hierarchy of communication between a prince and a king was codified in ways that made the asking into a specific act of both submission and assertion. Jon asked because asking was what sons did with fathers, and because the alternative, requesting through the council, which was what princes did with kings, would have turned the personal into the political, and Jon had enough political in his life. They were in the solar. Evening, the candles burning, the scrolls on Rhaegar's desk like a landscape of obsession, the specific terrain that Rhaegar's mind inhabited. I want to go to the wall. Rhaegar looked up. Maester Aemon's letters are... The reports from the Watch are deteriorating. The Rangings are losing men. The cold is wrong, moving, directional. Jon had prepared this the way he prepared everything now, with evidence, with the specific rhetorical structure that would land with a man who valued analysis. I need to see it myself. The wall is where the problem is. The problem you've been reading about for 20 years. The long night. The others. The thing, the actual threat that the prophecy describes. Jon leaned forward. Father, you've been preparing for this threat through prophecy. I want to prepare for it through reconnaissance. Send me to the wall. Let me assess the situation. Let me come back with intelligence, real intelligence. Not scrolls, not visions, information from the ground. Rhaegar sat with this. The conflict was visible, the specific Rhaegar conflict between the father who wanted his son safe and the prophet who wanted his son to fulfill the destiny, and the king who understood that intelligence from the wall was valuable, and the man who saw, in this request, the first steps of a son leaving. Arthur goes with you. I assumed. And you report to me. Everything you see, everything you learn. Ravens weekly. Daily. Daily then. Rhaegar looked at him. This is not about leaving. Jon looked at his father. The look was the most honest look Jon had given him in years, not the performance of filial devotion, not the management of expectations, not the careful navigation of the gap between what Rhaegar wanted Jon to be and what Jon was. Honest, it's about going where I need to be. Where you need to be is here. The prophecy says the prince confronts the darkness. The darkness is north. Jon held the gaze. This is what you wanted. This is what the scrolls describe. The prince goes north. I'm going north. He paused. The interpretation is different from what you expected. The mechanism is different, but the direction is the same. This was strategy. Jon was framing the trip in Rhaegar's language, the prophecy language, the destiny language, the specific vocabulary that Rhaegar understood and responded to. Jon didn't believe the framing, but the framing worked, and working was more important than believing. Rhaegar gave permission. Jon packed. Not much the specific sparse packing of someone who had been raised in a castle full of luxury and who was choosing to travel without it. The stark instinct for austerity expressing itself in a Targaryen prince who was, at 15, more northern than southern in everything except a dress. Rhaenys came to say goodbye. She found him in his chambers with Arthur, the knight helping Jon with the packing in the specific domestic way that Arthur helped with things efficiently, without ceremony, the task-oriented service of a man who had been caring for this boy since birth, and who expressed the caring through function rather than emotion. You're leaving. I'm going to the wall. That's leaving. That's reconnaissance. Jon, she held his gaze. You're leaving because you can't breathe here. Because every room in this castle has father's expectations in it, and the expectations are taking up all the air. Jon stopped packing. I'm not going to pretend I'm going for a different reason than I am. He looked at her. But the reason I'm going, and the reason I'm telling father I'm going, are not the same. And the difference is, it's the gap, Rhaenys, the same gap. I'm telling father, the prophecy sent me, because the prophecy is the language he speaks, and I need him to let me go. And the real reason? The real reason is, there's a problem in the north, and I want to solve it. Not as a prophecy, as a person with resources and intelligence, and the specific ability to organize a response. The problem is real. The prophecy's answer to the problem is magical. I want the practical answer. You want to go be Ned Stark. Jon blinked. You've met Ned Stark once, for 3 days, when you were 3. And you've been becoming him for 15 years. Rhaenys sat on the bed. The northern thing. The practical thing. The problems have solutions thing. That's Ned Stark. That's the Stark blood in you that father won't see. I'm not trying to be anyone. You're not trying. You are. You're Stark and Targaryen, and the combination has produced this. She gestured at him. A boy who can read prophecy in 4 languages and who believes in logistics instead. A prince who fights like a dragon and thinks like a wolf. You're the song of ice and fire, Jon. Just not the version father wrote. Jon looked at her. That's accurate, I know. I'm your sister. I pay attention. He hugged her. Brief. The specific Jon hug. Restrained. Charged. The hug of someone who held back, even when holding on, because holding back was the habit, and the habit was survival. Come back, she said. I will. Come back and tell father the truth. Which truth? All of them. The truth about the prophecy. The truth about who you are. The truth about what the answer actually looks like versus what he thinks it looks like. She held his gaze. He can take it. He's not fragile. He's wrong. And wrong people can survive being told they're wrong if the telling is done with enough love to keep the wrongness from feeling like rejection. You think he'll hear it? I think you're the only person he'll hear it from. Because you're the person the prophecy is about. If the prophecy itself tells the prophet that the prophecy is wrong, she shrugged. That's the version that might work. Jon finished packing. He left King's Landing on a Thursday morning with Arthur Dane, 20 men, and the specific quiet relief of someone leaving a room where they'd been holding their breath. He went north. Winterfell, what Jon found. 290 AC. He stopped at Winterfell, not because the itinerary required it. The itinerary was King's Landing to the Wall, direct, without stops. Jon stopped at Winterfell because the King's Road passed through the north, and the north passed through Winterfell. And Jon could not ride past the castle where his mother had grown up, without stopping. Ned Stark received him at the gate. It had been 12 years since they'd met. Jon had been 3. Ned had been Jon-remembered grey eyes and dark hair and wooden blocks, and the specific feeling of being seen without being studied. The feeling he'd been chasing his entire life, and that he'd found for 3 days in a nursery in King's Landing, with a man who looked like him, and who didn't look at him the way everyone else did. Ned was older, the grey in his hair that hadn't been there at 3. The lines that northern weather carved into faces that spent their lives outdoors. But the eyes were the same Jon's eyes. Lyanna's eyes. The grey that was Stark, and that Jon carried in a Targaryen court like a flag from a conquered kingdom. "My prince." "Don't." Jon said it before the formality could settle. "I'm your nephew. Call me Jon." Ned looked at him. At the 15-year-old, standing in the courtyard of Winterfell, with Arthur Dayne behind him, and 20 royal guards behind Arthur, and the specific visual incongruity of a Targaryen prince arriving at a Stark castle in northern clothes with a northern face and a northern name. "Jon." Then, something moved behind Ned's eyes. "You look like her." Everyone says the eyes. Not just the eyes. The way you hold yourself. Lyanna used to stand like that. Weight forward. Like she was about to move somewhere and hadn't decided where. Jon absorbed this. The specific hunger of a boy learning about his dead mother through the observations of the people who'd known her. The indirect reconstruction of a person through fragments. "I'd like to stay. For a few days. If stay as long as you want. This was your mother's home." Jon entered Winterfell. The castle was, he didn't have a word for what the castle was. Different from King's Landing in every axis that difference operated on. Where King's Landing was hot and bright and loud, with a specific chaotic energy of 500,000 people generating noise and smell and life. Winterfell was cold and grey and quiet, with the specific ancient weight of a place that had been standing for 8,000 years, and that radiated age the way hearths radiated heat. Jon felt something. Not the fire pool that Rhaegar described, not the prophetic tug that Rhaegar said was the Targaryen blood responding to its purpose. Something different. A grounding. The specific sensation of a person standing on soil that their blood recognized. The physical experience of being in a place that your body knew even though your mind had never been there. The Stark blood. He went to the Godswood. He went alone, not even Arthur, who understood that some walks required the specific privacy of a person encountering something for the first time, and who stood at the Godswood gate and let Jon go in alone. The heart tree. White bark. Red leaves, the face carved into the wood, the eyes bleeding red sap. The mouth open in the specific expression that was either anguish or ecstasy, and that the old gods had been wearing for 8,000 years, without clarifying which. Jon stood in front of the tree. He felt this was the thing he would tell Rhaenys later, in a letter that took him 3 days to write, because finding the words was like finding a path through an unfamiliar forest he felt known. Not watched, not studied, not catalogued or analyzed or measured against a prophecy. Known in the specific, total, undiscriminating way that the old gods knew things, without judgment, without expectation, without the conditional quality that every human interaction in his life had carried. The tree didn't want anything from him. The tree didn't think he was a prophecy. The tree knew what he was: ice and fire, Stark and Targaryen, the specific combination that the prophecy described, and that was, in the tree's presence, not a destiny, but a fact. A condition. The way brown hair was a condition. The way grey eyes were a condition. He was what he was. The tree registered it without interpreting it. Jon cried. He cried in front of the heart tree the way he hadn't cried since he was 3 years old, and Ned Stark had left Winterfell not loudly, not dramatically, the specific controlled release of a boy who had been holding something for 15 years, and who had found, in the presence of a tree that didn't want anything from him, the safety to put it down. He stayed in the Godswood for 2 hours. When he came out, Arthur was still at the gate. "Are you?" "I'm fine." Jon's voice was rough, not broken rough, the sound of a surface that had been scraped clean. "I'm better than fine." What happened? The tree. Jon looked back at the Godswood. The tree saw me. Arthur didn't understand this. Arthur was Dornish. And the Dornish did not worship the old gods, and the concept of a tree seeing you was outside Arthur's frame of reference. But Arthur had been raising Jon for 15 years, and the 15 years had taught him that some things the boy experienced were outside Arthur's frame of reference. and that the outside nest didn't make them less real. Good, Arthur said. Seeing is good. It's the first time. Arthur looked at him. The first time I've been seen without being studied. Without the you know the thing Father does. The watching that's not just watching. I know the thing. The tree doesn't do the thing. The tree just sees. Jon looked at Arthur. I'm going to come back here. After Wall. After whatever comes, I'm going to come back. Winterfell? The Godswood. The tree. The place where I'm just me. Arthur nodded. They stayed at Winterfell for 3 days. Jon met his cousins Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, the Stark children who were growing up in the castle where his mother had grown up, and who looked at him with the specific curiosity of children meeting a relative they'd heard about and hadn't met. Robb was 16, auburn-haired, the Tully colouring that was a contrast to Jon's stark looks. Robb was, Jon recognised this immediately, the thing Rhaegar wanted Jon to be. Charismatic, confident, the kind of boy who walked into a room and owned it through presence rather than performance. Arya was different. Arya was 9, and she was feral. The word was not accurate, but it was the closest available. She had the Stark looks, dark-haired, grey-eyed, the face that Jon saw in his own mirror, and she had the specific, uncontrolled energy of a child who had been told to be something she wasn't, and who was refusing the telling with every available tool. She looked at Jon. Jon looked at her. You look like me, she said. I look like your aunt. Same thing. She tilted her head. Are you really a prince? Technically, you don't look like a prince. What does a prince look like? Stupid, with gold hair. Jon almost laughed. The almost was significant. He hadn't almost laughed in months. King's Landing didn't produce almost laughs. King's Landing produced calculations. I have dark hair. So you're a better prince. Come fight me. You're 9. So? I have a sword. She produced a thin blade needle. She called it. My brother gave it to me. Which brother? The one who matters. She jerked her head toward Robb, who was watching this exchange with the amused tolerance of a 16-year-old who had been dealing with Arya's energy for 9 years, and who had developed the specific coping mechanism of letting Arya do whatever Arya was going to do, and managing the consequences afterward. Jon sparred with Arya. He pulled every hit. She didn't notice. She was fast, genuinely fast, the neurological quickness that lived in some bloodlines and that couldn't be trained but could be developed, and she attacked with the specific all-in commitment of a 9-year-old who didn't know what holding back was. Arthur watched from the fence. The ghost of a smile on Arthur Dane's face was itself an event. Arthur did not smile in public. Arthur's face was a professional instrument. The smile said, this girl fights the way Jon fights. The fire, the speed, the going before the gap is confirmed. She's good, Arthur said to Ned, who had come to watch. She's a terror. Ned's voice had the specific warmth that fathers' voices had when they were pretending to complain about their children, and the pretending was thin enough to be transparent. Kat wants her in skirts. Arya wants her in armor. I'm mediating. She reminds me of someone. She reminds everyone of Lyanna. They watched the children spar. Jon left Winterfell on the 4th morning. Arya cried loudly, publicly, with the unashamed grief of a 9-year-old who had found someone who understood her and who was leaving. Jon crouched in front of her in the courtyard and said, I'll come back. When? Soon. People say soon, and they mean never. I mean soon. She looked at him with the grey eyes that were his grey eyes. Promise? Promise. He rode north. Behind him, Winterfell grew small and then invisible, and Jon felt the specific tearing sensation of leaving a place that felt like home, and that he had been in for 3 days, and that he had been looking for his entire life. The Wall, 298, 299 AC. Castle Black was not what the histories described. The histories described the shield that guards the realm, the ancient fortification manned by the Night's Watch, the order that had protected the North for 8,000 years. The reality, a crumbling ruin manned by criminals and cast-offs, the dregs of a society that used the Wall as a garbage dump for its unwanted, and that funded the dumping with the absolute minimum required to keep the dumped alive. Jon stood at the base of the Wall and looked up. 700 feet of ice, the single largest structure ever built by human hands, ancient beyond reckoning, maintained through 8 millennia by an order that was now. Jon could see this, could quantify it. The logistics brain that Arthur and Rhaenys and the library had built, putting numbers to what the eyes could see. Undermanned by approximately 90%. The Watch had 10,000 men at its height. The Watch had under 1,000 now. The Wall had 19 castles. 3 were manned. The infrastructure was failing in the specific, slow-motion way that infrastructure failed when maintenance was deferred for decades. The stairs rotting, the tunnels narrowing with ice that nobody cleared, the specific accumulation of neglect that turned a defensive structure into a monument to institutional abandonment. Maester Aemon was waiting for him. Aemon was 101 years old. Blind. Small. The specific, diminished frame of a very old man whose body had been shrinking for decades. His mind had not shrunk. His mind was... Jon understood immediately, within the first 10 minutes of conversation. The finest mind Jon had ever encountered. Finer than Rhaegar's. Finer than Tyrion Lannister's, who Jon had met briefly at court. Finer than anyone's. Because Aemon's mind had been sharpened by 100 years of thinking, and the sharpening had produced something that was not merely intelligent, but wise. And wisdom was intelligence plus time, plus the specific, humbling lessons that time provided. You're Rhaegar's boy. I am. You have your mother's blood in your voice. The Starks, they speak from the back of the throat. The Southerners speak from the front. You speak from the back. I've never been north before this month. Blood speaks before experience. Aemon's blind eyes pointed in Jon's direction, with the uncanny accuracy of a man who had been blind long enough that the blindness had become its own form of sight. Sit, talk to me. Your letters have been inadequate. Articulate, but your right letters are inadequate for what needs to be discussed. Aemon leaned forward. You've been reading the original texts. The prophecy is ambiguous. Everything is ambiguous, prophecy especially. Prophecy is Aemon searched for the word, the 100-year-old mind sorting through a vocabulary that spanned 4 languages and a century of scholarship. Prophecy is a mirror. The seer looks into it and sees what they want to see and calls the seeing truth. Your father sees a prince who saves the world. You see a problem that needs solving. Through logistics, not destiny. And both of you are right, and both of you are wrong. Aemon smiled the smile of a very old man who had been watching Targaryens argue about prophecy for 80 years, and who found the arguing both tragic and amusing. The prophecy describes a real threat. Your father is correct about that. The Night King. The others. The army of the dead. These are not metaphors. These are things that exist and that are coming. Where your father is wrong, and where you may be wrong in the opposite direction, is in the mechanism. He thinks the mechanism is a person. You think the mechanism is an army. The truth may be both. Both. A person who commands an army. Not through prophecy, through competence. A person who understands the threat because they've studied it. Who organizes the response because they have the resources. Who fights the war because they were built for it, not by destiny, but by training and temperament, and the specific combination of bloods that gives them the Targaryen fire to fight and the Stark ice to endure. Jon sat with this. You're describing me. I'm describing a possibility. You, or someone else. Or no one. Maybe the threat is met by institutions, rather than individuals. The Watch. An alliance. A coalition. Aemon's voice was the voice of a man who had been wrong about prophecy enough times to distrust certainty. What I know, what I've learned in 100 years of reading these texts, is that prophecy describes the shape of the future without specifying the content. The shape is, a great cold comes, and the fire rises to meet it. The content, who, how, when, the specific mechanism is not in the texts. The content is in the world. In the decisions of the people who face the shape. So the prophecy is useless. The prophecy is a warning. Like a raven that says storm coming. The raven doesn't tell you how to survive the storm. The raven tells you the storm is coming. The survival is yours to figure out. Jon looked at this ancient Targaryen, his great-great-uncle, the man who had been at the wall for 60 years, who had refused the throne when it was offered, who had chosen the watch and the cold, and the specific monastic service of a man who believed that duty was more important than destiny. How do I figure it out? Go up the wall. Look north. And then Aemon paused. And then come back down and start working. Not prophesying. Working. Building the response. Mining the dragon glass. Reinforcing the watch. Doing the specific, unglamorous, non-prophetic work that saves people. Father Won't Your Father will have to accept that the prince who was promised is a logistics officer rather than a mythic hero. That's his problem. Your problem is the logistics. Jon went up the wall. 700 feet. The wind. The north stretching to the horizon, and beyond the horizon to whatever was building there. The cold that the watch reported, and that Jon standing at the top, standing in the wind, standing with the Stark blood responding to the north, the way the Targaryen blood responded to fire could feel. Not the prophecy's pull, not the mystical summons that Rhaegar described and that Jon had never felt. Something different, something practical, the awareness of a threat, real, material, physical, and the specific response that the awareness produced, which was not awe or terror, or the specific religious experience that prophecy demanded, but the practical, analytic response of a person encountering a problem and beginning to build the solution. Jon looked north. He thought, it's coming. He thought, we need more men, more dragonglass, more steel, better infrastructure, a plan that doesn't depend on one person being magical. He thought, I'm going to build that plan. He came down. He started working. The return. What Jon brought back. 299 AC. Jon stayed at the wall for 8 months. He did not stay as a prince. He stayed as... This was the thing that confused the watch, and that Arthur managed, and that Maester Aemon found both admirable and slightly absurd. As a volunteer. He ate what the watch ate. He slept where the watch slept. He trained with the watch, the recruits, the seasoned rangers, the specific population of the wall that was composed of every kind of man the realm produced, and that had been discarded, or sentenced, or self-selected into the order. He went on rangings, 3 of them, beyond the wall, into the haunted forest, into the territory where the watch's reports said things were wrong, and where Jon discovered that wrong was an understatement of the kind that only military reports produced, the bureaucratic understatement that said unusual activity when it meant the dead are walking. He saw them, on the 3rd ranging, 2 days north of the wall, in a clearing that the maps didn't name. Dead men, walking, organized. Moving south with the specific directed purpose of things that were being controlled by something that wasn't present in the clearing but that was present in the air, in the cold, in the directional wrongness that the watch had been reporting, and that nobody in King's Landing had taken seriously, because nobody in King's Landing had stood in a clearing and watched dead men walk. Jon stood in the clearing. Arthur stood beside him. Arthur was for the first time in Jon's memory afraid. Not combat afraid, not the specific adrenaline fear that fighters processed into fuel. The other fear. The deep fear. The fear that happened when a man encountered something that was outside the categories his experience had built, and that the categories could not contain. That's real, Arthur said. Yes, those are dead men. Walking, yes, the prophecy, forget the prophecy. Look at the dead men. Jon drew his sword, not Dawn, a regular blade. Look at them and tell me, is the answer to that a prince with the right blood? Or is the answer to that 10,000 men with dragonglass and a reinforced wall? Arthur looked at the dead. He looked at Jon. Both, Arthur said. The answer to that is both. They fought their way out of the clearing. Lost 2 men watch rangers, seasoned, who went down because dragonglass wasn't available in sufficient quantity and regular steel didn't work on the dead the way regular steel worked on the living. The dead fell and got up and fell and got up, and the falling and getting up was the specific horror of fighting something that didn't obey the rules and that continued to exist through damage that would have killed anything alive. Jon survived because he was fast, and because Arthur was Arthur, and because the ranging party had 6 pieces of dragonglass between them, and the 6 pieces were enough to kill 6 of the dead permanently. 6 out of 30. The math was terrible. Jon came back to Castle Black, and he wrote. He wrote for 3 days. Not letters or report. The specific, detailed, logistically grounded document that described what he'd seen, and what it meant, and what the response needed to be. The report was not prophecy. The report was military intelligence, troop estimates, terrain analysis, vulnerability assessment, the specific, Cold-blooded language of someone describing a threat and calculating the resources required to meet it. He sent the report to Rhaegar. He sent a copy to Ned Stark. He sent a copy to every Lord Paramount in the 7 Kingdoms. Arthur watched him send the ravens. Your father is going to... My father is going to read a military intelligence report that confirms the threat he's been prophesying about for 20 years. And that proposes a response that has nothing to do with prophecy. He's going to be angry about the method, and he's going to be right about the content. And the gap between the anger and the rightness is the gap we've been living in my whole life. And the other lords? The other lords are going to read a report from a Targaryen prince who has been at the wall for 8 months, and who has seen the dead with his own eyes, and who is requesting men and resources in language they understand. Military language, not mystical language. Jon sealed the last raven. Father couldn't get the lords to take the threat seriously, because Father described the threat in the language of prophecy. Prophecy is a court discussion. Military intelligence is a war council discussion. I'm changing the venue. That's strategic. I was going to say risky. Everything I do is risky. Being alive is risky when you're me. Jon sent the raven. I'm going home. King's Landing. King's Landing. To finish the conversation. King's Landing. The confrontation. 299 AC. Jon arrived at King's Landing on a Tuesday, and the arrival was noticed. Not because of ceremony. Jon had travelled without the royal retinue, without banners, without the specific performance of princely return that the court expected, and that Jon had deliberately avoided. The arrival was noticed because Jon had changed, and the changing was visible, and the court, which processed visual information about the royal family with the specific obsessive attention of an institution whose survival depended on reading the powerful, the court saw the change and began calculating what it meant. Jon was taller, broader. The 8 months at the wall had built the body that King's Landing's training yards had been building, but differently, harder. The specific northern conditioning that produced endurance rather than aesthetics. His face the softness was gone. The 15-year-old prince who had left had been replaced by something leaner, older. The face of someone who had seen dead men walk, and who carried the seeing in the specific way that soldiers carried combat. He looked like a Stark. He had always looked like a Stark. But now the looking had a quality that it hadn't had before, a severity, a weight. The specific visual register of someone who had spent 8 months in the north, and who had absorbed the north the way his blood said he should. Aaliyah saw him first. She was in the corridor outside the throne room, and she stopped when Jon came through the doors, and she looked at him, and her face went through the specific complicated process that Aaliyah's face went through when she encountered something that challenged her management surprise. Assessment. Recalculation. You grew. I was at the wall. I know. Your father has been, she paused. Your father has been reading your report. For 3 days. He hasn't slept. Good, not good. A Targaryen king who hasn't slept for 3 days because his son's report has confirmed his prophecy and contradicted his method is not, she stopped. You need to talk to him. I'm going to talk to him. Talk to him gently. I'm going to talk to him honestly. Those are not the same thing, and you know it. Aaliyah looked at him. 26 years of managing Rhaegar Targaryen in her gaze, the accumulated expertise of a woman who had learned, through marriage and motherhood, and the specific long education of being married to a prophet, how to deliver truth to a man who processed truth through the filter of destiny. Honest is necessary. Gentle is strategic. Both. Jon, not just one. Jon looked at Aaliyah. The woman who had raised him, not mothered him. She had been clear about that distinction. But raised him, fed, housed, managed, educated in the specific ways that mothers educated and that Aaliyah had provided, despite the fact that Jon's existence was the evidence of her husband's betrayal. 26 years of doing the right thing for a child who was not hers and whose existence was a daily insult. Thank you, he said. For what? For all of it. The raising, the management. The you didn't have to. I did. Not for you, for me. Because not doing it would have made me someone I don't want to be. She held his gaze. Go, talk to your father. Tell him the truth. And when the truth breaks something, because it will remember that the breaking is the sound of something old making room for something new. Jon went to find Rhaegar. He found him in the solar, where Rhaegar always was. The scrolls on the desk, the candles burned low. The specific visual evidence of a man who had been at his desk for 3 days, processing information that confirmed his greatest fear and undermined his greatest belief simultaneously. The report was on the desk. Jon's report, annotated in Rhaegar's hand, the margins filled with notes, the text circled and underlined and cross-referenced with the prophecy texts that were stacked beside it. The report and the prophecy side by side. The military intelligence and the mystical prediction placed next to each other by a man who was trying to find the connection between them. "You saw them," Rhaegar said, not looking up. "I saw them. The dead. 30, in a clearing 2 days north. Organized, moving south." Jon sat across from his father. "I lost 2 men. The report says what I saw, in the language of military intelligence, not prophecy." Now Rhaegar looked up. His face. Jon had not seen his father in 8 months, and the 8 months had done something not to Rhaegar's appearance, which was the same silver-haired perfection that had defined Rhaegar's public image for 20 years, but to the thing behind the appearance. The thing behind the appearance was Frey. The obsession, which had been Rhaegar's constant companion for 20 years, had been working on him while Jon was gone, and the working was visible in the eyes that were slightly too bright, and the focus that was slightly too intense, and the specific quality of a man who had been alone with his certainty for too long, and who had not had the moderating influence of the sun who challenged the certainty. "You changed the venue," Rhaegar said. "I sent the report to every Lord Paramount. I know. I've received ravens from." He looked at the pile. 7 lords. Asking about the report. Asking about the threat. He looked at Jon. Asking what they should do. And for the first time in 20 years, the lords of the 7 kingdoms are asking about the threat because a prince told them about it in their language rather than mine. Jon leaned forward. "Father, the threat is real. You were right about that. You've been right about that for 20 years. The long night is coming. The dead are walking. The watch can't hold them. The wall is undermanned and crumbling, and the response that the realm needs is massive and immediate and logistical. The prophecy is a warning, not a plan." Jon held the gaze. "Maester Aemon, your great uncle, the man who's been at the wall for 60 years, says the prophecy is a mirror. The seer looks into it and sees what they want to see. You saw a prince, a hero, a single person who saves the world through the power of the right blood. And what do you see? An army, resources, dragonglass mined from Dragonstone, Valyrian steel redistributed, the watch reinforced. A coalition of lords who understand the threat and who contribute men and material to the response." Jon leaned back. Not a prophecy. A military campaign. The largest military campaign in the history of the realm. Organized and executed by a king who has the authority to command the resources, and a prince who has seen the enemy and who knows what the resources need to be applied to. A king and a prince. You and me. Together, your authority and my intelligence. Your position. And my plan. Rhaegar, he looked at Jon the way he had been looking at Jon for 16 years, the dual gaze. The love and the prophecy occupying the same eyes. The father and the prophet unable to separate themselves from each other. And then Jon saw this. Felt this. The specific moment when something shifted behind his father's eyes, the dual gaze changed. Not completely. Not permanently. But in this moment. In this room, with the report on the desk, and the scrolls beside it, and the 16 years of watching and cataloguing and expecting and hoping between them, the gaze simplified. For the first time, Rhaegar looked at his son and saw his son. Not the prince who was promised. Not the Song of Ice, not the answer to the 1,000-year question that had organized Rhaegar's life and destroyed his first marriage and started a war and killed the woman he loved. His son. A 16-year-old who had gone to the wall and seen the dead and come back with a plan, who had Lyanna's eyes, and Lyanna's stubbornness, and Lyanna's specific quality of looking at the world as it was, rather than as prophecy said it should be. A person. The prophecy Rhaegar started. Jon waited. Rhaegar stopped. He set down the scroll he'd been holding. He looked at the desk, at the prophecy texts, at the 20 years of obsession that was arranged in neat stacks around the military intelligence report that his son had produced. "Your mother said something. At the tower. When he stopped. started again. She said, "Let him be a person first. The rest can come later." He looked at Jon. "I didn't listen. I know. I've spent 16 years looking for the prince who was promised in a boy who wanted to be just a boy. Not just a boy, a person. With skills and training and a plan. A person who can help. Not through destiny, through work." Jon held the gaze. The prophecy was the warning. "I heard the warning. I'm responding to the warning. The response looks different from what you expected. But the direction is the same. North. North." Rhaegar sat with... The sitting was long. The specific Rhaegar process of encountering a new framework and deciding whether to demolish the old one to make room for it. The demolition was, Jon could see this, enormous. 20 years of certainty. The identity of a king built on the foundation of a prophecy. The conviction that had organized everything, justified everything, cost everything. Demolishing it meant the war was not necessary. Lyanna's death was not necessary. The 20 years of obsession were not preparation for a destiny, but the specific tragic waste of a brilliant man pursuing a thesis that was not wrong about the threat, but wrong about the method. Demolishing it meant, I was wrong. Rhaegar Targaryen had never been wrong. Not because Rhaegar was never wrong, because being wrong was not something the architecture of Rhaegar's identity permitted. The certainty was structural. The certainty was the building. And admitting the wrong was demolishing the building with himself inside it. Jon watched his father sit with this. He did not push. Pushing was what the old Jon would have done the Targaryen speed. The going before the gap is confirmed. This Jon, the Jon who had been at the wall, who had stood in a clearing with dead men, who had cried in front of a heart tree, this Jon waited. The waiting was the Stark in him. The waiting was the thing that Arthur had been trying to teach him for years, and that the North had taught him in 8 months. Wait. Let the gap open. Let the person across from you arrive at the place you need them to be, rather than dragging them to it. Rhaegar arrived. All right. His voice was rough, not the polished, measured, princely voice that Rhaegar used in public. Rough. The sound of a man whose internal architecture was undergoing renovation, and who was speaking from underneath the scaffolding. All right. The plan. Your plan. The military response. Yes, tell me, Jon told him. The plan was comprehensive. 8 months at the wall had produced troop requirements, dragonglass mining estimates, wall reinforcement engineering, watch recruitment targets, supply chain logistics, the specific detailed operational plan that turned a vague threat into a structured response. Jon presented it the way Arthur had taught him to present things clearly, with evidence. Trusting the evidence to do the persuading. Rhaegar listened. He listened the way he should have been listening for 16 years, as a father hearing his son, not as a prophet evaluating a prophecy. The listening was different. The listening produced different responses, practical questions, strategic observations, the specific contributions of a brilliant king who was, for the first time, applying his brilliance to the problem rather than to the framework surrounding the problem. Dragonstone, Rhaegar said. The dragonglass. We can mine it. I own the island. The deposits are massive. Massive enough for the wall and for distribution to every lord's armory in the realm. And the watch recruitment. You're proposing a royal mandate, not criminals. Volunteers, paid, equipped, rotational service 3 years, with leave. With the specific treatment that professional soldiers receive, rather than the treatment that penal labor receives. Rhaegar considered this. The lords will resist. The lords will resist until they see the report. The report is persuasive. The report is terrifying. Terror is persuasive. Rhaegar almost. The almost was the sound of something old breaking and something new growing in the break. Not the full demolition of the prophecy framework that would take years, if it happened at all, because 20 years of certainty didn't demolish in an afternoon. But a crack. The first crack. The specific structural failure that happened when a building encountered a force it wasn't designed for, and that began the slow process of coming down. I'll call the lords, Rhaegar said. To King's Landing. A great council. Not for prophecy, for the report. Your report. Presented in your language. Our language. Military, practical, northern. Rhaegar looked at him. You went north, and you came back northern. I went north, and I came back me. Is that different? Yes, they sat. The scrolls were still on the desk. The prophecy texts. The 20 years of obsession arranged in neat stacks. Rhaegar looked at them. I'm not going to burn them. I'm not asking you to. They're not wrong. The threat they describe is real. You've confirmed that. The threat is real. The mechanism is yours, not the scrolls. Yours, Rhaegar held his gaze. You're the prince who was promised, Jon, not because the prophecy says so. Because you went to the wall, and you saw the threat, and you came back with a plan. That's not what the prophecy is what I say it is. I'm the king, and I'm telling you, the prophecy is fulfilled by a prince who prepares the realm for the threat through military intelligence and dragonglass mining and watch reform. He paused. It's a less dramatic fulfillment than the scrolls describe. It doesn't make a good song. Songs are lies. Songs are simplified. Like prophecies. Rhaegar picked up a scroll, looked at it, set it down. Your mother asked me to let you be a person first. I didn't listen. But the person you became the person who went to the wall and saw the dead and wrote a military report instead of a prophecy. That person is better than anything the prophecy could have produced. Father, I'm saying something that needs saying, and I need you to let me say it without interrupting, because the saying is costing me a great deal, and the cost is going to get bigger if I have to restart. Rhaegar looked at him. I was wrong. Not about the threat, about you, about what you are. I spent 16 years looking at you and seeing a prophecy, and the looking, the studying, the watching. The cataloguing that looking was not fathering. That looking was, I don't have a word for it. Research. I was researching my own son, Jon's eyes, and the researching cost you. I can see what it cost you in the way you hold yourself, in the distance you maintain, in the fact that you cry in front of trees but not in front of me. Rhaegar's voice cracked. Not dramatically, with the specific rough fracture of a man saying something he had never said, and that the saying was stripping from him layer by layer. I know about the godswood at Winterfell. Arthur told me. You cried in front of a tree because a tree saw you without studying you. That he stopped, breathed. That's what I took from you. The being seen. I replaced it with being studied, and the replacement is it's the thing I regret most. More than the war. More than Lyanna. More than any of it. Jon sat. He sat with this. He sat with the specific, unprecedented experience of hearing his father say the thing, the actual thing, the core thing, the thing that had been sitting in the gap between them for 16 years, and that neither of them had been willing to name. I'm sorry, Rhaegar said. 2 words. 11 letters. The most difficult sentence Rhaegar Targaryen had ever spoken. Harder than the surrender terms at the Trident. Harder than the coronation oath. Harder than the scroll translations he'd spent decades decoding. 2 words that required the demolition of a building, and the admission that the building had been wrong, and that the wrongness had damaged the one person the building was supposed to protect. Jon looked at his father. I know, he said. Not I forgive you, not it's all right. Not the easy, complete, dramatic absolution that songs required, and that reality didn't produce. I know. The acknowledgement that the apology had been heard, and that the hearing was the beginning of something that would take time, not the end, not the resolution, but the start of the process of rebuilding the thing that had been damaged. The plan, Jon said. The dragonglass. The watch, the great council. Yes, we do it together. Yes, not as prophet and prophecy. As father and son. Rhaegar looked at him. Father and son, Rhaegar repeated. Is that's enough? Rhaegar picked up the report. Looked at it. Put it at the center of the desk where the prophecy scrolls had been. That's more than enough. They worked. For the first time in 16 years, they worked together not as king and destiny. Not as prophet and sign, but as 2 people with different skills applied to the same problem. Rhaegar's authority and Jon's intelligence. Rhaegar's political network and Jon's military analysis. The father's position and the son's plan. The combination was devastating. Not in the way the prophecy had predicted, not the mystical, transcendent, fire and ice resolution that the scrolls described. In the practical, grinding, logistical way that real problems were solved. Through lists and letters, and the specific administrative machinery of a kingdom mobilizing against a threat that the kingdom had been ignoring for 8,000 years. Rhaegar called the Great Council. Jon presented the report. The realm began to prepare. Aegon, the other prince, 299 AC. Young Aegon found Jon in the logistics office on the first night back. He came without announcement. Because Aegon did things without announcement. Because Aegon had spent his entire life being the prince who wasn't the prophecy, and who had therefore developed the habit of moving through the Red Keep without attracting the attention that Jon attracted simply by existing. He was 18, silver-haired, his mother's eyes in his father's face. He stood in the doorway of the logistics office and looked at his half-brother, surrounded by maps and manifests and the specific organized chaos of a military campaign being born on paper. "You came back." Jon looked up. "I came back. Different. Different how? You left as someone running from the prophecy. You came back as someone who found something to replace it with." Aegon sat on a crate. The logistics office was not furnished for visitors, being composed primarily of crates and tables and the functional equipment of someone who valued utility over comfort. Grain allocation, supply chain management. Is that what saves the world? Supply chain management. That's what saves the world. Jon held his half-brother's gaze. The prophecy says, a prince with the right blood stands in the fire, and the darkness retreats. Reality says, 10,000 men with dragonglass hold a line. The prophecy makes a good song. The reality makes a survivable outcome. Aegon was quiet. Between them, always between them, the complicated silence of two boys who shared a father and a name and a dynasty, and who had never been able to share the thing that brothers usually shared, which was the assumption that they occupied the same category in their parents' estimation. Jon was the prophecy. Aegon was the heir. The distinction had shaped everything. Rhaegar's attention went to Jon because Jon was the prophecy's subject. The throne would go to Aegon because Aegon was Elia's son, and the law of succession was clear. The distribution produced two princes who were each the most important thing in different systems, and who had never been able to reconcile the systems because the systems were designed by a father who held contradictions rather than resolving them. "I was relieved," Aegon said, "when you left for the wall." Jon didn't flinch. "Not because I wanted you gone. Because when you're here, Father is watching you. And when Father is watching you, he's not watching me, which means I can be myself. Whatever that is." Aegon looked at his hands. "I'm the heir to the Iron Throne, and the thing I'm most grateful for is that my father doesn't pay attention to me." That's a strange thing to be grateful for. It's not strange. It's the cost of the watching. The watching that you got. The watching that I got. And that I'd have given you if I could have. Aegon almost smiled. "You'd have given me the prophecy. In a heartbeat. And I'd have given you the obscurity. In a heartbeat." They looked at each other. Two princes. Two halves of a system that their father had built, and that neither of them had chosen, and that both of them were shaped by. "The supply chain plan," Aegon said. "I read it. And I can help. Not with the logistics, you're better at logistics than anyone in the Red Keep. With the political dimension. The Lords. The small council." He held Jon's gaze. "I'm the heir. When I tell a lord to contribute men and material, the telling carries the weight of the succession. Your plan needs resources. Resources come from lords. Lords respond to the person who will be their king." Jon looked at him. "You'd do that. I'd do that. Not because I love you, I'm still figuring that part out. Not because of the prophecy, I've never believed in the prophecy. And hearing that you don't believe in it either is the first thing you've ever said that made me feel like we're actually related." He stood. "I do it because it needs doing. And because we're brothers, half-brothers, whatever. We share a name and a father and a dynasty that's going to survive or collapse based on what we do in the next year. I'd rather it survive. Egg, don't call me that. Rhaenys calls you that. Rhaenys is Rhaenys. You're you. We're still figuring out what we are." "Fair. Start with the dragonglass." "I'll start with the lords." Aegon went to the door. Stopped. "And Jon?" "Yes. Welcome back." He left. Jon sat in the logistics office with the maps and the manifest, and the specific warmth of a moment that was not reconciliation, and not forgiveness, and not the dramatic resolution that songs required, but that was something. A starting point. The beginning of a brotherhood that had been deferred for 18 years by a prophecy that had taken up all the available space, and that was now, brick by brick, being dismantled to make room for something more useful. Something practical. Something real. The Great Council. 300 AC. They came. Not because of the prophecy, because of the report. Jon's military intelligence document, distributed to every Lord Paramount, had produced the first serious conversation about the northern threat in living memory. The conversation was not mystical. The conversation was, how many men? How much steel? How many wagon loads of dragonglass? The Northerners came because Ned Stark vouched for the report. Ned had received his copy and had sent his own men to the wall to confirm, and the confirmation had come back with the specific, brutal clarity of Northern military assessment. The boy is right. The dead walk. Send everything. The reach came because the Tyrells recognized an opportunity to position themselves as essential, the grain and the logistics that a military mobilization required, the specific economic contribution that made the Tyrells indispensable in wartime, the way they were indispensable in peace. Dawn came because Doran Martell, who had been managing the complex relationship between Dawn and the Crown since the rebellion, saw in the Great Council an opportunity to demonstrate Dornish value that went beyond the specific historical grievance that had defined the relationship for 20 years. Even the Stormlands came. The former rebel lords, defeated but not destroyed, who had been managing the uncomfortable position of defeated but necessary, and who found in the Great Council a cause that was larger than the rebellion, and that allowed them to contribute, without the contributing feeling like submission. Jon presented the report. He presented it from a table, not a throne, in military language, not court language, with maps and numbers and the specific logistical detail that made abstract threats concrete, and that turned the deader coming into this, is how many wagons of dragonglass we need per castle per month. The lords listened. They listened because the language was their language, not prophecy, not destiny, but the specific military logistical vocabulary that lords understood, because lords were, at their core, men who managed resources, and who responded to arguments framed in the language of resource management. The Great Council produced a royal mandate for dragonglass mining at Dragonstone. The island's obsidian deposits were massive enough to arm the Watch and every lord's garrison in the Seven Kingdoms. Rhaegar committed the Crown's resources to the mining and the distribution. A watch reform. Volunteers. Paid. Equipped. Rotational service. The specific professionalization of an institution that had been running on criminal labor and institutional neglect for centuries. The reform was funded by a tax that the lords grumbled about and agreed to, because the alternative, the dead at their doors, was worse than the tax. A military coordination. Not a single army or network. Each kingdom contributing men and material to a defensive architecture that stretched from the wall to the neck. Supply chains. Communication lines. The specific infrastructure of a realm preparing for war. Jon oversaw the logistics, not as a prophet, not as a prince fulfilling destiny, as a military commander organizing a response. The title was practical, and the work was practical, and the practicality was the thing that the prophecy could never have produced, because prophecy produced heroes, and heroes were individual, and this threat required not an individual, but a system. Rhaegar watched his son work. He watched from the gallery during the Great Council, and from the small council table during the planning sessions, and from the doorway of the logistics office that Jon had commandeered in the lower levels of the Red Keep. He watched the way he had always watched Jon, but differently now. The watching had changed. He saw his son. Not every time. Not consistently. The prophecy was still there. The 20-year architecture didn't demolish in months. And there were moments when Rhaegar caught himself looking at Jon and seeing the prince who was promised, instead of the boy who was planning. But the moments were fewer. And the seeing was more frequent. And the gap, the 16-year gap between father and son, the gap shaped like a prophecy, was closing. Not closed. Closing. The distinction mattered, because the distinction was honest, and the honesty was the thing that Jon valued, and that Rhaegar was learning to provide. Rhaenys found Rhaegar in the gallery after the second day of the council. You're watching. I'm watching my son save the realm through supply chain management. That's not how you imagined it. No. Rhaegar looked at the gallery below, where Jon was in a heated discussion with a Reach Lord about grain. Allocation that involved pointing at a map and using words like throughput and staging area, and the specific vocabulary that Rhaegar had never used, because Rhaegar's vocabulary was prophecy and poetry, and the elevated. Register of a man who communicated through meaning rather than mechanics. I imagined fire and ice. I imagined destiny. I imagined a song. A song. Yes, the prince who was promised fighting the Night King with a flaming sword in a battle that decided the fate of the world. And instead you got a logistics officer arguing about grain, Rhaegar watched Jon stab a finger at the map, and the Reach Lord conceding the point, with the grudging respect of a man who had been out-argued by a 16-year-old. He's better than the song. He's real. He's real. The song was... I built the song. In my head. From the scrolls and the visions and the specific Targaryen compulsion to find meaning in the blood. He looked at his daughter. Your mother tried to tell me. Lyanna tried to tell me. Arthur tried to tell me. Aemon tried to tell me. Everyone tried to tell me, and I couldn't hear it because the song was louder. And now? Now I'm listening to my son argue about grain, and I'm... His voice did something. Not breaking. Adjusting. The specific tonal shift of a man who was experiencing an unfamiliar emotion and who was discovering at 40 that unfamiliar emotions were possible. I'm proud of him. Not as a prophecy. As a person. My son. Who went north and saw the dead and came back with a spreadsheet. Rhaenys looked at her father. That's the first time you've said that. Said what? My son. Without the prophecy attached. Rhaegar was quiet. It feels different. Better. Lighter. He paused. Like setting down something heavy. Setting down 20 years of certainty is going to feel lighter. That's how relief works. He looked at the gallery. Jon was still arguing about grain. The argument was intense. The Reach Lord was objecting to the allocation ratios, and Jon was defending them with the specific, passionate detail of someone who had done the math, and who knew the math was right, and who was not going to surrender the math to someone who hadn't done it. Rhaegar watched. He saw his son. Just his son. The gap closed a little more. What if Jon Snow was raised by Rhaegar Targaryen? He was not raised at the wrong table. He was not raised with the word bastard, and the specific daily erosion of a boy told he was less than what he was. He was raised at the right table, in the Red Keep, with the silver and the gold and the dynasty and the crown. He was raised by a father who loved him, who held him, who watched him grow and learn and fight and read and become. He was also raised by a father who couldn't stop looking at him as a prophecy. That was the cost. Not cruelty, not abuse, not neglect, in the traditional sense. Something subtler and almost worse. The specific experience of being loved and studied simultaneously, of being a son and a subject in the same gaze, of growing up knowing that your father held you and catalogued you in the same gesture, and that the cataloguing was louder than the holding. Jon survived this because Jon was Stark. The northern blood that his mother gave him, the blood that looked at prophecy and saw logistics, that looked at destiny and saw problems, that looked at the mystical and said, yes, but how many wagons of dragonglass do we need? He went north. He saw the dead. He came back with a plan that was not a prophecy, but a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet saved the realm in the way that spreadsheets saved things. Not dramatically, not poetically, through the specific, unglamorous arithmetic of supply chains and dragon glass allocation, and the grinding, daily, invisible work of preparing for a war that the songs would make sound simple. And that was, in reality, the most complex logistical operation in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. He was not the prince who was promised. He was better. He was the prince who prepared. The distinction was everything. The prophecy said, a prince will save the world through fire and destiny. Jon said, a prince will save the world through dragonglass and grain allocation. The prophecy was a song. Jon was the work. And in the end, in the specific, practical, northern end that Jon would have chosen for himself, and that the prophecy never imagined, the work was what saved them. Not fire.
He spent 3
not
months in the
destiny.
cave.
Not
When
the
he emerged,
mystical
he was
fulfillment
different.
of a 1,000-year-old
Not changed the way that
prediction,
fools change
translated
people,
through
not
40
broken and
languages,
rebuilt.
and interpreted by a
Changed the
man
way
who
that
couldn't see
learning
his own
changed
son
people the
with
same
the glare
person
of
with
his
more
own
tools.
certainty.
The same architecture with more rooms.
The daily,
The
unglamorous,
specific expansion that
unsung
happened
work
when a
of
mind
boy who
discovered
was
it
raised
was
by a
larger
prophet
than it had
and who
thought.
chose to be an engineer.
He went south.
Rhaegar watched
He went
this,
back through the Black Gate
and he saw,
and back
at
to the
last,
wall.
Too late.
And he arrived
and
in
just in
Castle Black
time, and
on
in
a
the
morning
specific,
in late
complicated
spring.
simultaneity
And the watch
that
garrison
defined
which had been
everything
told
about
by
Rhaegar
Rhaegar
Targaryen.
Winterfell
He saw his
that
son,
Lord Stark's youngest
not the
son
prince
had
who was
disappeared
promised.
north of the wall,
his son,
and that a search was underway.
Just his
The watch
son.
garrison received him with the
That
specific
was the
combined
prophecy
relief and
fulfilled.
confusion of men who had
Not
been
in
looking for
fire,
a missing child,
not in destiny,
and who found instead
in a father
a boy who
finally
didn't
seeing
look
a
lost.
boy.